Morning and welcome to the 24th meeting of the. That's not going to work, Lucy. I'm sorry. To the 24th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Can I take the opportunity to apologise for the technical difficulties we were having there this morning? And before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and staff present that social distancing measures are in place in committee rooms and across the Holyrood campus. In addition, a face covering must be worn when moving around, exiting and entering the committee room, although they can be removed once you are seated at the table in the committee room. Can I also remind all those present to turn any mobile devices to silent so that they do not disturb the committee's work? We have received apologies from Bill Bowman. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. Do any members object to taking item 3 in private? If Colin Beattie, who is joining us remotely, objects, please raise your hand. I confirm that that is agreed. Agenda item 2 is the Post-Legislative Scrutiny, the Lobbying Act 2016. At our meeting today, the committee will be taking evidence from 2 panels of witnesses, all with an interest in the Act. We have around 80 minutes for each panel. Can I welcome our first panel of witnesses, Peter Duncan, convener of the Association for Public Affairs, who is joining us remotely, Gregor Scotland, Principal Policy Advisor, CBI Scotland, who is also joining us remotely, Willie Sullivan, Senior Director of Campaigns and Scotland Electoral Reform Society, who is appearing on behalf of the Scottish Alliance for Lobbying Transparency, who joins us in person, and Craig Wilson, Public Affairs Officer, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, who is joining us remotely. Willie Sullivan, just to note that when you speak, your microphone will be activated automatically, so there is no need to touch it. And if you would like to respond to any question, please raise your hand and just make it clear to myself or to one of the clerks. Witnesses joining us remotely, please raise your hand on the screen. I can see it from here in the chamber, or type R into the chat function if you want to respond to a question, and the clerks will alert me to that also. If at any point we lose the connection with you, I will come back to you at a later point. The committee paper suggests focusing on 2 themes for each panel of witnesses, and I intend to structure the evidence session around these themes. Members will be asking questions, but I would encourage witnesses to respond to each other too. We do want this to be a genuine discussion. In this session, I would like to initially explore the impact and operation of the Act before moving on to consider whether and what legislative change is required. So, focusing on theme 1 of the, first of all, which is the impact and operation of the Act, can I ask just for a general overview from each panel member to start with any key thoughts or they have on the impact on the operation of the Act to date, and if they wish, they can add a line on why they care about it and what they think should happen going forward. So I'll kick off with Willie Sullivan, who is right in front of me, and then I'll go to Peter Duncan, who's joining us remotely.
Okay, I might start with why I care about it and then talk about the impact. I mean, I think democracy is a process that's built on trust, and that is the trust that the electorate, the ballot and the public opinion will hold government to account to make decisions and to govern in the interests of the people and of the nation. And lobbying, the sharing of kind of experience and evidence and to make better policy is a really important part of good governance as well. But to answer the question in whose interest, I think the influencing process must be as clear as a summer's day. If it's not possible to know who is talking to who in power and why, if the system is in the dark, then it's very difficult to develop that trust. If I have to say I'm a lobbyist for the Electoral Reform Society, trust me, that's not really enough. So transparency encourages us to be our own best selves, really. We live up to our own expectations because we know the public and the media and that are watching us. And to answer, so we don't think, and when we lobbied at the beginning for the details of this bill, we wanted it to be much stronger, but we're happy to accept that it was a step in the right direction, that it said that Scotland should have a lobbying register, like most other liberal democracies, that we were open to this idea of transparency because we knew it was important for the democratic process, that the public could see what was going on, could see who was talking to who, and the question in whose interest could be answered. But the impact on that principle, I think has been a good one, because it's, you know, there is that information there and people know it's there. It's just not nearly enough, and there's too many loopholes and too many ways around it to really make it that instrument that gives democratic trust in who's talking to who and why. And there's always this question about what problem does it solve? Well, the problem of transparency solves the problem of not enough transparency. And that is as I say, a fundamental part of the democratic process. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sullivan. I'll now go to Peter Duncan. Again, the impact and the operation of the Act to date. Any general thoughts, Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Convener. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. I mean, first of all, why it's important to me, I suppose two things come to mind. As per the Association of Scottish Public Affairs, is was the default representative body for people across Scotland who are engaging with the Parliament in various ways, whether they're consultants or whether they're working in-house in a range of charities. So I suppose it's our day job, that's why it's important. But I think the other reason it's important, as indeed the Minister spoke very passionately about it when he introduced the legislation some years ago, he spoke very clearly of the role that lobbying plays in making for a better Parliament and making for better informed legislators, and ultimately for delivering better legislation. And that's why I think it's particularly important that we revisit the legislation and see whether where we can help it work better. But as far as my reflections on the last couple of years, I mean, it's certainly the case that I think overwhelmingly this transparency has not revealed any great scandal. It's not revealed any great shocks. It's not revealed any great transgressions. And actually, the way in which people who are embarking upon lobbying across Scotland have proactively and positively engaged with the lobbying registrar and complied with the regulations, as the registrar makes clear in his recent report released this week, compliance has, generally speaking, been very good. There's been no resort to legal sanctions, and I think that's to be welcomed. But I think whilst we had scepticism at the start, we accept that the will of the Parliament is there to regulate lobbying and to have a lobbying register. We now want to make it better. We want to help you make it better. We have some specific suggestions as to how that might happen. And we have some specific opinions as to some directions of travel that might prove fruitless in the overall scheme of things. One final point, if I may. I think as far as transparency is concerned, I'm not sure the man on the street has recognised any great revolution in transparency. I'm not sure there is any great suggestion that there is some great revelation now that wasn't in place before. But we accept there's a will to see this information. We've provided it willingly, and we are engaging positively with some ideas as to how it might be better in the future.
Thank you, Peter Duncan. We will explore some of those suggestions in the next part of our conversation. I'll now turn to Gregor Scotland from CBI Scotland.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you. In terms of why we have an interest in the Act, we have an interest both as an organisation that has to comply with the Act, but also as one that represents a variety of members and businesses of all shapes and sizes that have to do so as well. And since the Act came into force, I think we've had over 100 entries of regulated lobbying to date. And the first thing I would do is just to put on record our thanks to the Registrar and his team, both for an engagement since the Register became operational, but also beforehand, just in terms of helping us to raise awareness and understanding of the Act among the business community. Picking up on the point that Peter made, I mean, we're proud of that level of political engagement. Lobbying does have an absolutely crucial role in the policy development process and the development of legislation, and we should be encouraging the widest possible interaction between our parliamentarians and external stakeholders, and we hope that is the prism through which this review can be seen. In terms of our own operations, the introduction of the Act certainly hasn't changed the way that we carry out our lobbying activity. We still do things in exactly the same way as we did before the Act came into force, and In the process of preparing for this review, we consulted with a variety of organisations of all shapes and sizes about their experience of the Act. And while I think there is genuinely a really shared commitment to transparency here, what came out of those conversations was a lot of the practical challenges that come from complying with the Act, from the process of making data entries itself, to the need for clarity on some of the exemptions. There are lots of things that we think could be improved about the Act. That's why in our written submission to the committee, we call for a focus on some basic improvements that can help make it easier to use and clearer to interpret, rather than expansion of the scope.
Thank you, Gregor Scotland. I'm now going to turn to Craig Wilson from the SCVO.
Thank you very much, Convener. I suppose to reflect on the first question about why SCVO cares about this, reflecting what Gregor just said, SCVO obviously is an organisation that has to comply with the lobbying registrar, so we've got a personal interest, but SCVO obviously also represents 2,000 plus voluntary sector organisations in Scotland who are also having to do the same. Just to rewind back in time a little bit, in 2016, SCVO was sceptical of the concept of a lobbying register. We were concerned that would have a chilling effect on the ability of Scotland's voluntary organisations to work in the way that they had been working with Parliament up until that point. And only recently we published a book looking at 20 years of positive engagement that the third sector has had with the Scottish Parliament, and we cherish that, and we were concerned that the Lobbying Act would put up an unnecessary barrier to that continued engagement. I'm pleased to say that we've probably softened our approach substantially in that the organisations that we've spoken to continue to carry out the work that we want them to, and that they are keen to do. So I think our position is softened. Certainly we understand there is a strong temptation, as Willie suggested, to increase transparency and to increase perhaps the communications that are covered by the Act. But again, that we have to strike that balance between how do we ensure transparency, but also involvement with the Parliament that isn't overly cumbersome. So, as you suggested, Convener, I think a lot of those suggestions and where we go with that will be discussed later on.
Thank you, Craig Wilson. I'm now going to turn to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to have a little look at generally the administrative burden that's being perceived that the Act places on companies and businesses. Do you think that the register and the lobbying returns are a proportionate way to capture information about certain types of lobbying?
Willie Sullivan, kick off for us.
Peter Duncan's on screen, so perhaps he'd like to comment.
I've got Mr. Sullivan in front of me who is indicated to speak, and then I'll go to Peter Duncan.
Okay.
I think everybody thinks that the way that, we certainly think that the way that data is collected and inputted could be made better. So there's actually a way to increase the transparency and increase the amount of information that's available while decreasing the burden in some ways, because if the data was organised and the input was organised in a different way, for example, if campaigns were logged and then activity meetings, and we would advocate budget as well put against the campaigns, then that would decrease the amount of burden of time having to fill in the return. Another suggestion that we have is if the organisation's information was just collected once and not on every time there's a meeting, then that would also save a lot of time. And so there's a way of organising the data that actually means that you can increase transparency while reducing the bureaucratic burden.
Just on the back of that, do you think people have had the need to take on additional staff in order to cope with this? So not only has it added to an administrative burden, has it actually added to costs?
These are I mean, for us, and we're people can speak for their own organisations. For us, it's it's a six monthly return. It probably takes about an hour. So the level of kind of burden that the current capture of information is required is half an hour in staff time. I mean, we're quite active politically with the Electoral Reform Society. Our whole job is democracy and politics. So I don't know about other organisations, but certainly not for us and for any of the members of SALT. There's nowhere needed extra people.
Thank you for that, Mr Sullivan. Before you come back in, Colin Beattie, I'll allow Peter Duncan and probably Craig Wilson to respond to those two questions as well. Peter Duncan.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, I think on the administrative burden aspect, I mean, I think if it is fair to reflect, I think, that whilst the number of registrations on the lobbying register are at the top end of that which was expected when the regulations were introduced, I think it's also fair to say that those registering would reflect that the administrative burden has been at the upper end of that which they expected when we embarked upon this route. I mean, I suppose the answer to Willie's point about is this just an hour every 6 months? I think it depends what kind of organisation you are, and I think it depends on the number of times you're having registerable conversations with ministers, MSPs, and with special advisors, etc. So I think fundamentally, I mean, certainly I would reflect amongst those that members who have passed on their views to us, they reflect that yes, the user interface is something which is very almost 19th century rather than 21st. So that needs work. I think we're disappointed that at the very lower end of those who are lobbying less frequently, there isn't an app, but it can be done very easily and straightforwardly and quickly. And at the top end, for those that are doing a lot of lobbying, that there isn't a bulk upload facility where they can collate the information locally and then upload it in one go. So I think there are some things we can do to reduce the administrative burden, but fundamentally, organisations that embark upon lobbying they are like every other business, every other charity, every other organisation in Scotland. They're under pressure to do more with less time, and every incremental increase in burden is one which is difficult to cope with and places additional stress on already stressed organisations.
Thank you, Peter Duncan. Just nod if people agree with this. The comment that Peter made, because I saw Willie Sullivan nodding around the interface and the ease of use of registering. Is that a general agreement in terms of an improvement of the interface and trying to get us into the 21st century, perhaps app-based? Is that a general agreement? Yep, okay, excellent. Craig Wilson, any comment on Colin Beattie's question about extra staff costs or extra staff needed from an umbrella body such as yourself? Any reflections from your members?
Certainly, I mean, we tried our best to come to the committee with something tangible about that. We found that through surveys that 70% of organisations had dedicated staff who would manage submissions. I would suggest that most of those organisations haven't had the luxury of employing an extra member of staff, nor would it be needed. We reckon from that survey that organisations are spending about 3 hours a month, uploading submissions to the registrar, which isn't bad. It's not overly burdensome in the way that we perhaps feared. But I would agree with some of the comments that other people have made to that. The issue is more with the user experience. That could certainly be streamlined and made a bit more user friendly. We found that of organisations who had made submissions, 65% had submissions returned, and that was because they possibly hadn't filled it out in the right way, or there was a fundamental misunderstanding about what constitutes lobbying, which I'm sure we could talk about all day. But There are certainly areas where it could be improved, that the user experience is easier and slicker. The bulk submissions is a great idea as well. You'll have seen it yourself, the number of organisations that have got a display at the bottom of the lift. They're speaking to MSPs about a single issue, and they could easily submit 120 odd returns for that one event, but instead they'll be asked to submit 120 individual responses. So there's certainly room to improve the user experience, to reduce the burden that we all fear.
They seem like two very sensible and easy, or at least sound easy approaches. Colin Beattie, do you have any follow-up questions before I turn to Graham Simpson?
Yes, I'm just wondering whether there's any evidence that the need to submit the information returns has changed the way in which your organisation or members lobby. So, for example, are you avoiding face-to-face communications in favour of emails, letters and so on?
I'm going to turn to Gregor Scotland, who I think wanted to come in on the previous question, but you can answer this one as well in terms of for CBI Scotland, and then I'll turn to Peter Duncan, and then I'll come back to Willie Sullivan.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I'll pick up on both of those points. Going with Mr Beattie's second point first there about changing the way in which we lobby. There's two things I want to pick up on. From our perspective, in terms of the lobbying activity we carry out ourselves, absolutely not. It hasn't changed our approach, and we continue to do things in exactly the same way as we did before. And from the conversations we've had with a range of businesses over the last 2.5 years, they're always centred around how do we make sure we're complying with the legislation? I've had so many of those conversations, I couldn't even remember them all. I haven't had a single one about, how can we change what we're doing to make sure that our lobbying is not captured on the lobbying register. So I think there's a genuine commitment to transparency there, to complying with the legislation as it exists. Just picking up, I won't take up too much time, Convener, but just on the Mr Beattie's previous point about the administrative burden, we've heard time and again that it's onerous, time-consuming, and involves a lot of unnecessary repetition. So the single thing could be done to make the biggest improvement be that bulk upload from a spreadsheet feature. I know there's a bulk upload function that exists already, but I don't think that allows you to do it from a spreadsheet. And most of the organisations we've spoken to collate their lobbying as they go in the form of a spreadsheet, and being able to upload that all at the same time rather than individually be a big time saver.
Thank you. Peter Duncan?
Yeah, just to come in on the question of administrative burden. I mean, one area where I think particularly the committee could usefully throw some light is on events. I think the events burden in particular is something which, around the margin, and this gets to the heart of Mr Beattie's question of, is there activity not happening that would otherwise have happened with the regulations not in place? And I think by definition, at the margin, there must be probably some conversations that would otherwise have happened in person that are happening by telephone. I have to say it's not something that is widely reported to me. It's not something that I notice. But by definition, if there's any at the margin movement, it's going to be a movement away from face-to-face contact. And similarly on events, I think where there might just be significant at the margin is a concern amongst quite small charities. If they're running, for example, an event in Garden Lobby back in the dim and distant happy days where we used to have face-to-face events in Garden Lobby, where you potentially have very significant numbers of attendees, very significant numbers of conversations, and actually some of the regulated persons, not all MSPs are as well known as those on this committee. Similarly, special advisors are not always as well known, and there is a fear amongst some smaller organisations running events that they're failing to capture, and sometimes at the margin that might shy them away from events. And I think there must be a better way of capturing single big events that actually are communicating the same basic message to actually the whole Parliament, not just the 9 or 19 or 49 MSPs that happened to attend in the Parliament.
Thank you. Peter. Willie Sullivan?
Yeah, I think Peter's got a good point about the events. On the point about whether people move to different forms of communication, I just think anybody that's lobbying, if they get the chance to speak face to the person that they want to influence or talk to, probably takes it. I mean, the question is more, you know, there is a lot of activity that has been and has always been not face to face, through emails, telephone calls. You know, we weren't sure if the Skype camera was on or off, would that be captured by it, because it's, you know, face-to-face and video calls. So I think there's a need to kind of bring that in line with even the UK, but, you know, most over other states that have lobbying registers, you know, phone calls and emails are captured by that, because obviously it needs to be transparent in that way.
I think more phone calls and emails are happening because of the legislation.
No.
Or no?
No, I don't think there's more happening. As I said, I think if you get the chance to speak to the person you want to talk to face, you'll take that opportunity. But there's still a whole body of communication and influencing going on that is not on the register and not seen. So I think that's the point I would make on that. On the, you know, a lot of the administrative burden has probably in the beginning been on returns. People saying the register saying, well, that's not really lobbying, and part of that is because our definition of lobbying in Scotland is so narrow. There has to be an ask involved in the meeting. You know, whereas like we know relationship building is a huge part of lobbying. You know, finding out who's doing what, getting information going in two ways. So I think to make the definition like it is in the UK or in Canada and in Ireland to be about government or parliamentary business. So if you're meeting for relationship building, we think that should be included as well. There was one other point. Yeah, I think on the registration, you know, you could, if I think I said this, but if the information about the registered lobbyists and themes, etc., can just be done every 6 to 12 months, that cuts out repetition. So that would definitely ease the burden, administrative burden. There's a lots of ways to ease administrative burden without reducing transparency. In fact, we would suggest you can increase transparency with probably a lesser administrative burden.
Thank you. Craig Wilson, then we're going to turn to Graham Simpson.
Just on the point that was made about what negative impact this had had, we found from our survey that, you know, in keeping with what the other people had said, that only 90% of organisations had said that it had no negative impact on the way they lobby. But as Peter said, you know, at the margins of that, you've got that 10%, which is sizable. You know, there's 40,000 voluntary organisations in Scotland. If 10% of them feel uncomfortable about the lobbying activity that they would otherwise have done, then it's worthy of note. I think from SCVO's point of view, we have to be, going back to the point about events, we have to be very cognizant of what staff are there, who they're speaking to. So quite often we would bring along to a parliamentary event our digital engagement team or our employability services, who are not you know, as familiar with the requirements of the Lobbying Act. And it is, you know, slightly frantic. You're trying to keep an eye on who's speaking to who. We tend just to try and work our way around that and make sure that everything's registered. We ask people afterwards who they spoke to, but as Peter suggested as well, you might not know if you've spoken to someone. There is a genuine risk that you're accidentally non-compliant with the Act, and some organisations will certainly not take the risk of being accidentally non-compliant and choose not to bring certain members of staff who might give a fuller understanding of what their organisation does.
Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I completely agree with this. These thoughts about the events. If we ever get back to having events, then I can really see the problem for organisations there. So the ability to make some sort of overarching submission that, yeah, I think that's good. Can I just put something to you? And my understanding of the Act is that if any of you approach me, you have to make a submission. If I approach you, you don't have to make a submission, but we could have exactly the same conversation. Now, is that right? Should that change?
Willie Sullivan.
I mean, there is a concern that's been expressed to me that ministers are inviting people to come in to see them, and therefore it's not on the register. It was, you know, the fish farming industry was the one that was quoted to me, that there was a lot of lobbying going on which had been invited in by the minister. So yeah, I mean, you know, if it's an area of concern. If the public know that loophole, then they're going to ask questions about, you know, why is that being done in that manner. So I'd say it's something that should be looked at.
Graham Simpson?
I'm just wondering if anyone else has a point on that, because that, it seems to me that it is a loophole. You're not picking up every meeting if an MSP, for example, has...
I can see Craig Wilson wants to come in.
I think probably everyone's got some examples of a potential loophole, and it's a rabbit hole of loopholes. There's so many interesting and strange ways that the Act works that, you know, for example, if I were to speak to an MSP about all the great things that SCBO does, but not necessarily ask anything of an MSP or a minister, that is not regulated lobbying. However, if I were to email them the next day and say, further to our conversation, would you mind doing X, Y, and Z, then I think that wouldn't be regulated as lobbying either. It's quite unusual how some of this works. But again, it's striking that balance between how much additional burden you place on organisations, what requirements are you making of them to catalogue all of their conversations, versus transparency. So it's a strange one.
Graham Simpson?
Yeah, I'll ask a different question now. Some of you have mentioned the interface, so that is how it works for you, but let's have a look at how it works for members of the public if they're looking at the register and trying to find out who's met who. So if you do that, you could click on my name and you could see that I've met, I don't think I've been lobbied by any of you, but let's say I'd met Willie Sullivan. There, Graham Simpson's met Willie Sullivan on such and such a date. So you would click on that and you would see what we broadly discussed. Then if you want to have a look at the rest of my meetings, you have to go back to square one. So it's actually very, very difficult and time consuming if this is all meant to be about transparency. Have you any thoughts on that?
Willie Sullivan?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the public gets information about how its government and politics works is through the media, and a couple of journalists have spoken to me and said, look, we want to use this information more, but it's really, really difficult to query it and to find stuff and to amalgamate stuff together. So I think you're right. If there's a question of transparency, then it must be not only about how we interface it, but how the public can look at the data and information and understand it, and how make sense of it, really.
Peter Duncan wants to come in, and then I see that we've also got... Well, I'll take Peter Duncan first, and then I'll look at indications again.
Yeah, sorry, it was actually just on the previous point about meetings at the request of the minister or an MSP. I mean, certainly ASPA is of the view that is one of the improvements that we think could be made to the regulations. There's no reason, particularly our view, that if you're asked in to discuss blue coffee cups, the reality is conversations very, very rarely stay contained within the blue coffee cup sphere. Usually there's a conversation develops and that widens out. And I think the easiest way to straighten out that loophole is to make all these conversations registerable, whether they're initiated at one end or the other. On the point that Mr. Simpson makes about, sorry, I've mind blank. I'll come back to you.
No problem, Peter. I realise we're tight for time, and we are straying into theme 2 anyway, so we can perhaps move on to theme 2. I just wanted to ask one thing in conclusion to this, and I see Gregor Scotland wanted to come in as well. Just going round one time is, do you think the Act has increased transparency? Do you think we have full transparency? Do we have shades of transparency? And do you think it's helped increase trust in politics and politicians? Because that was the purpose of the Act. Do you think it's achieved that? I'll start with Gregor Scotland first.
Thank you, Convener. I'll pick up on your point first, and then if there's time, I'll just refer to a couple of Mr Simpson's points as well. I think the sheer volume of data that is now available means you can make a case that this has improved transparency. I think there's over 12,200 entries that are available if you can find them to look at. What is less clear, as others have already touched on, is what value this has brought and what this collection of data has actually achieved. I haven't seen any evidence about who accesses this information. Is there demand from the public to see it? I'm not even sure what the level of demand from the media to look at it has been, whether it's met the expected level. It's also difficult to sort of assess the Act's wider impact, in that, you know, it's not clear precisely what problem it was intended to solve in the first place, and whether there was any fundamental problem in its addressing was up for debate. Of course, didn't think that was necessarily the case. Just picking up on the point that Mr Simpson raised about the exemption if you're invited to give evidence or views by an MSP or a minister. I do think, at the very least, that is an area that needs further clarity. I can give you one example just to highlight that, and that, you know, at CBI Scotland, we are quite regularly invited by government ministers to a meeting to give business views or priorities on a broad range of issues. Now, most people, including ourselves, regard that as an opportunity to lobby, which is why we tend to register that, despite the fact that we were actually invited by the MSP or the minister. However, we've heard from other trade associations that in a very similar situation, their entry has been rejected because they were invited by the minister to give evidence. So I think some further clarity on that point would be good.
Craig Wilson.
Of shades of transparency. Certainly, you know, as Gregor said, there is additional information there, which is, you know, generally a good thing. And I think one of the things we've been most pleased about is that it really shows the level of engagement from the voluntary sector. 40% of all returns were from a sort of voluntary charity organisation, which we sort of suspected all along, but it was interesting to see that actually detailed. In terms of public trust, I would agree. I don't know who's really engaging with this. I think some of the press pickup on it has been somewhat predictable and skewed in terms of actual whether people are engaging with the relevant information or data. I'm unsure. I would say, though, that the fact that we can see visibly that the voluntary sector is the most engaged sector, that might improve trust in politics. I think people would be pleased to see that.
Willie Sullivan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point about the fact that we know that Scottish civil society is strong and engages with the political process is a positive thing. I think this is like, you know, we would argue that, as others have, that the potential, that information being there and the potentiality of transparency is quite important, that people know that these things are there and registered. But I would say that this is the beginning towards a much more transparent and system, and it's not the end. So and until there's enough meaningful data and complete data, and it's searchable and questionable and groupable, then it's not had the impact on transparency that it could and might.
Peter Duncan.
I mean, you know, as far as the trust in politicians point is concerned, I mean, I don't know that there's been any significant change in that regard, and certainly would be impossible to suggest whether these regulations have contributed to any great change. I do think there is a very legitimate point for the committee and Parliament to consider as to whether, as to what value this increased information has been put to. I mean, I don't get the sense that there has been a public clamour for the information. You know, taking your point about the difficulty and practical difficulty to download the information from the register, you know, members of the public, I suspect, are not phoning the register regularly to make observations about how difficult that is, because they're simply not challenge to do it. If transparency means more information being available, then yes, by definition, we are more transparent than we were 2 years ago. I just question to what purpose that is. The public information is always a good thing, but it doesn't come without cost, and it doesn't come without a compliance burden on those who have got to provide it. Therefore, I think the balance that's got to be struck is, if we're going to have regulation in this area, let's retain that focus on those elements of lobbying which Parliament quite clearly decided first time round were the most influential. That's face-to-face contact. Let's retain that focus on that and try and make the system as easy as possible for people to comply with. That strikes me as being the best approach, and certainly from ASTA's perspective, that's the way forward. That's the way in which we should be considering this review.
There's probably a supplementary to that, Peter, but I'll hold back just so we can conclude this theme and we can ask it in theme 2. But I believe Alec Neil has a supplementary.
Yeah, just following on from what Peter and the others said, I mean, when you go back to the original purpose of the Act, it really was twofold. One was to increase transparency, but the second one was the reason we wanted to increase the transparency was to make sure that lobbyists were not having an undue influence on the decision makers, on the decisions of legislators and the government and the Parliament. So the real question and the real measure here isn't just whether we've got more transparency. Blatantly, we have more transparency, although there's an issue about whether we need more transparency, and that's a fair question. But the real question is, has this additional transparency been evaluated to find out if lobbyists for vested interests, whether they be commercial or otherwise, are having an undue influence on the decisions being made by the people being lobbied? So is there any evidence, one way or the other, that lobbying has actually influenced decision-making at a government level or at a parliamentary level?
Billy Sullivan.
I don't think we have enough information possibly to make that judgment, but I would say it's a multi-million-pound industry. It's a multi-billion-pound industry all over the world. I don't know if these people are like spending their money on it and not thinking they're going to influence public policy, because we're pretty sure that they do, and I'm pretty sure that they think they do as well.
Measure of the success or otherwise of the Lobbying Act in achieving its objectives. I think we would all agree it has achieved objective number one. There is blatantly more transparency, although there's a subsidiary issue as to whether there's a need for more. But the real issue at the guts of this is, are decisions in this building, as you would think they would be, say, in the American Congress, unduly influenced by lobbying by vested interests? And if we don't know the answer to that, in my view, we cannot properly assess whether the Lobbying Act has actually achieved that second objective. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody's actually looked at that systematically. There's been no research done. Maybe it's something we should consider commissioning, convener. But in the view of the panel, is there any evidence that vested interests, be it charities or commercial interests or whatever, that the Lobbying Act is telling us whether there is undue influence on the decision-making by legislators as a result of lobbying?
So I'm going to go to people, because I do want to move on to the next theme, because I mean that is quite a broad question. I think the point that Mr. Sullivan was making, and I won't go back to repeat it all, is they must be lobbying for a reason.
Exactly.
So clearly they've got influence. If there's thousands of people lobbying, then clearly they're doing it for a reason.
Exactly.
Would probably be the answer. So Peter Duncan and then Craig Wilson, and then I'm going to move on to the next theme, please. I'll go to all three remote witnesses, please, just for a brief comment, and then I'll move on to the next theme. I'll start with Peter Duncan, and then I'll go to Gregor Scotland and Craig Wilson.
Thank you, Peter. I go back to the contribution I made right at the start and reflecting on the minister's statement. You know, as he said in the during the passage of the bill, lobbying is a good thing. It informs the legislative process, and one man's vested interest is another man's person with a genuine opinion. And I think, in some ways, how we reflect upon this, there's this sort of, I would regard a sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink suggestion that lobbying is some sort of dark art. There are some very admirable lobbying exercises over recent times, whether it's patients' rights, whether it's charitable interests, whether it's cancer charities looking for greater investment in their sector, whether it's Marcus Rashford. I appreciate that hasn't reached, that's been Westminster rather than Holyrood. But these are, I just think this suggestion that have people been influenced by lobbying? Well, that lobbying happens in all sorts of ways. It happens when a constituent comes to your surgery, and it happens when someone who has a point of view to inform your decision makes that point to you in a reasoned and professional way. And that I think is something which certainly at ASPA we stoutly defend as something which informs policymakers and delivers better legislation as a result.
It's not just lobbying. The issue is undue and unfair and arguably in some cases illegal lobbying. If somebody came to lobby me about a government contract, I would regard that as completely out of order, for example, Peter. So my question is the Lobbying Act telling us any more than we knew before it about whether undue, unfair, illicit lobbying is taking place, or have we driven that underground?
Well, Mr. Miller,
I want to avoid us getting down a rabbit hole of a conversation here and move on to the next theme. So, Peter, if you respond to that quickly, and then really brief comments from Gregor and Craig, so we can move on.
I'll answer it quickly. On the legal point, there is no evidence that I can see in all of the information returns that have been published that there's illegal activity going on. As far as unfair or undue influence, frankly, that's a judgment for policymakers to make, but I think it is part of the principle of an open parliament that people who have a point of view and want to inform policymakers are able to make that point of view known, and are able to impart that information to an open and modern parliament.
Gregor, Scotland.
Thank you, Convener. Peter kind of stole my thunder there, so I'll be brief. I do think it's very important to make that distinction between undue influence and influence, because lobbying should influence our parliamentarians and government officials. That is how we get to a situation where we have well-informed and well-scrutinised public policy and legislation. And in short, I haven't seen any evidence from the Lobbying Register or otherwise about examples of undue influence being exercised. So again, I would probably echo Peter's thought that that's something that maybe MSPs themselves or government ministers are in a better position to answer, but I certainly haven't seen any evidence to suggest there's undue influence being exercised.
Craig Wilson.
Yeah, it's an extremely important distinction. I perhaps misunderstood Mr. Neil's question in the same way that, if you were asking, has lobbying worked? I think that's a service we would pay for, because we would love to know the impact that the ideas and suggestions we make actually have. But I suppose that ultimately comes back to the question of, should MSPs have the ability to add to the lobbying register if they themselves feel that they have been influenced, or, as Mr. Neil put it, unduly influenced? Is that something that it might not be reportable, but it's something that they would wish to put on record and say, I met with this organisation, here's what was discussed, in tandem with lobbyists and voluntary organisations, business organisations, just to add a layer of transparency, at least to make it an option to MSPs and ministers and civil servants.
Thank you, Craig Wilson. I deliberately let that run on a little bit, because we did venture into theme 2 anyway in terms of our first part of our conversation, but to formally kick off theme 2 on the status quo or legislative reform, I'm going to hand over to Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Yes, we kind of dipped into this area a few moments ago, but it's a good opportunity, I think, for our contributors to get something on the record. So in theme 2, we're looking at whether we should have the status quo or whether we should have legislative reform. And the committee's Section 50 review is specifically looking at 2 matters: the communication methods that are used. As we know that it's face-to-face lobbying that's covered by the Act, so should that be opened up to include other communication methods? And the people that are deemed subject to regulated lobbying are people like us, MSPs, members of the government, including law officers, junior ministers, special advisors, permanent secretary. So should that group be widened to include others? So it would be really useful, convener, I think, to hear the views of all our panellists so we can get this quite clearly on the record what your thoughts are.
We kick off with Gregor Scotland, who I see is indicated.
Thank you. I'll address the people covered by the Act first and then move on to the types of communication. And our view is very much that the Act in its current form does cover the right group of people, basically the key decision makers. And I'm not clear about what the benefit exactly would be of extending that, other than obviously it would significantly the administrative burden that organisations and potentially the registrar's team faces. I think there are a couple of practical considerations to take into account in any conversation about potentially extending the Act to more civil servants. I think firstly, as I know a number of organisations raised in their written submissions, knowledge of the civil service grade structure is very limited at best. So extending the Act to include more civil servants would run the risk of putting organisations off from engaging with government officials from fear of falling foul of the Act by accident. And I do think that it would potentially as well risk politicising civil service roles that are certainly not currently political. And just one example of that, we spoke to a number of businesses about this who have a lot of day-to-day contact with government officials, often, for example, in the energy and infrastructure sector. That can be operational matters, it can be resilience, and anything that would be viewed as a barrier between a barrier to that kind of communication. Not particularly helpful. Just on the range of communications covered, first of all, I think it's important to say that we recognise there's a legitimate question here being asked about whether or not phone calls, for example, should be included. I think what we need to remember as part of this conversation is the importance of transparency, but importance of striking the right balance between transparency and protecting, the accessibility of Holyrood for all stakeholders without incurring unnecessary or excessive burdens. Again, I'll come back to the issue of what is the specific problem we're trying to solve here. Is there evidence that something needs to be addressed? The range of communications that are covered was debated at length when the bill was going through Parliament first time around, and face-to-face communication was deemed to be most influential, the most effective type of communication, and I don't think that element has changed over the last 2.5 years. In terms of what has changed, obviously, is the impact coronavirus restrictions have had on the way that organisations are communicating with policymakers. I think the biggest difference we've seen has been, certainly in our own organisation, is a real uptick in the use of video calls and video conferencing, which obviously it's important to know are all covered by the Act. This is another area, though, where I think you could, focus on some practical changes to the guidance to improve things and make it clearer. For example, it's a bit unclear what happens if some people have their videos on and some people have it off, or you have your video on for part of the meeting, but the MSP turns their video off. So I think some clarity around the guidance for video conferencing, which is already would be one practical way of addressing some of the challenges from the way communications changed as a result of coronavirus. And if I've got time, Convener, just one last point on emails. I know the sheer volume of emails that MSPs and politicians in general get, which means that would be a huge task for registering all of that communication, again, for organisations and the registrar's team. So many emails I know don't even get read, never mind by the MSP, but sometimes by the MSP staff either. So it's very difficult to quantify what, if any, impact an email has. I do think that communication is very, very different to face-to-face communication. I don't think there's a particularly strong case for expanding that type of communication.
Thank you, Gregor Scotland. Peter Duncan.
Convener, I think I can help you with your timeline here and say that, to put ASPA's view on the record, I think our view concurs almost exactly with Gregor's in this respect. In our view, extending the scope of the Act beyond the current group of individuals with whom regulated lobbying takes place, i.e. going to other civil servants, would be a mistake. The lines are not so clearly delineated. It is not clear who would and would not be, for example, a grade 6 civil servant. I think we would find that very difficult to accept. And as far as the type of communications that should fall within regulated lobbying, I fall back to the original view of the Parliament, which is let us focus on those particularly persuasive conversations, and we all know if me or one of my clients are looking to convince or inform an MSP of a particular case, the most powerful way to do that is to have a face-to-face meeting. And I think, therefore, it was quite right that the Parliament chose to focus upon that area. As far as widening it out, I think the administrative burdens will very quickly go out of control. Really difficult to verify who reads an email, whether that has been sent, whether it's been read, whether it's been read by a member of staff. I think Parliament is at risk of going down a route which makes it very difficult to determine whether the information that's being reported is remotely accurate, never mind meaningful.
So I think there's agreement between ASPA and CBI on that. I'll only take SCVO or SALTs before I take the next member, if they disagree with that, or do you agree with that? Disagree, Willie?
Yeah. Okay, this is why these guys are such good lobbyists. So in the scope of the regulated communication, the current definition is so narrow it's almost meaningless, particularly in an area of social distancing. They're also confusing with the registrar still not able to clarify whether cameras should be turned off or turned off camera makes a call unregulated. Scotland is notably out of step with other major democracies. The registers in Ireland and Canada cover all forms of communication with decision makers, however made. Even countries with less comprehensive lobbying legislation, such as the US and the UK, include oral and written communications in their definitions of lobbying. To meet best practice and international standards, this major loophole needs to be closed because it's avoiding transparency. We need to update the definition of regulated lobbying to include all forms of oral and written communications. On the coverage of public officials, when we were debating this and arguing for this last time, the argument was made that civil servants were not decision makers and should not be included. However, the answers of respondents to the committee's calls for evidence highlights that civil servants are a key target area for lobbying, ranking higher than groups like MSPs, researchers, party political staff and members of the Scottish Government. At the moment, a key route for influencing policy is currently not being captured by the register. The level at which civil servants should depend upon the level of accountability they hold, with those that are who are accountable to the Government and Permanent Secretary as part of their job description considered at an appropriate level. These changes would not be a disproportionate burden when compared with other major democracies. For example, Ireland requires coverage to extend to groups such as councillors. Therefore, the coverage of the legislature should be extended to include, at the very least, Director Generals, those running directorates and senior civil servants in categories SCS1 and SCS2.
So that's in terms of people covered. In terms of the range of communications covered, should it be everything? Is that what you're suggesting?
We're seeing oral and written communication as in, as I said, even
phone calls, emails.
Yeah,
all the,
yeah,
okay.
And that's standard across most countries that have got registered. Even ones that aren't as comprehensive as ours. In the US, you have to register all of those communications.
Okay. A follow-up question, Mr. Coffey, before I turn to Mr. Bibby?
Just finally, if I've got time to hear from Craig, I don't think we heard from Craig there.
Does Craig Wilson, I didn't get an indication that Craig Wilson wanted to come in. Does Craig Wilson want to come in?
Yep, just briefly, I mean, it's a very mixed bag, and we would want to do probably a lot more work with the sector before we fell down on any one side of that debate or another. But certainly there was, I think 70% of organisations that we spoke to had said that they would be open to the idea of more communication being brought in. But they are very, conscious of the fact that that is an additional burden, and as are we, and we'd be careful to strike that balance between good democracy and transparency. I think some people certainly were of the view that they wouldn't mind doing a little bit extra if they could see that it was contributing to transparency. I also think that if that burden can be reduced that we spoke about in stage one of the discussion, perhaps just accepting lobbying returns on face value. If I felt that I had lobbied an MSP and submitted that, I think that should be accepted. But organisations, 70% of them are finding that they're getting stuff bounced back because they didn't lobby in quite the right way. So I think if there was going to be a discussion about that communication reach expanding, then there would certainly need to be a conversation about reducing the burden at the same time to establish some sort of equilibrium.
Willie Coffey?
No, really clear views expressed there. Thanks very much for making that contribution. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Neil Bibby?
It does appear that there's a pretty big loophole in terms of telephone conversations and telephone calls. I hear what the panel said earlier about face-to-face meetings being the most effective way of influencing decisions, but would the panel accept that after that it would be telephone conversations and telephone calls?
Who wishes to kick off for us on that, if I get an indication? Gregor Scotland?
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, no, I don't think there's any doubt that there is value to having a telephone conversation, but I do know from our experience, if we are keen to engage with a parliamentarian, a government minister or a senior official, we would always, in the first instance, try to do that in a face-to-face way. Obviously, in a COVID era, that would be in a sort of normal meeting, and in the current climate, offer would be for a video call, which is obviously already covered. As I said in my first sort of remarks about this, I appreciate there's a debate to be had here, but I do think in the context of this discussion, it's important that we strike that balance. We do want transparency, and there's a commitment to transparency to make sure that the insurance system is still open and accessible for all organisations and individuals to inform that process without placing any unintended or unnecessary burdens on top of those that already exist.
Peter Duncan wanted to come in.
Actually, Gregor's covered my point, but I mean, just to reinforce, I think the other difficulty with the more you extend the scope of these regulations, then the more questions you raise. So, for example, is a telephone conversation with the Chief of Staff of MSP, does that become just as influential as actually speaking to the MSP themselves when they're about to prepare some contribution to a debate? So, I go back to my point. Parliament's visited this already. Took the view that face-to-face conversations were the most influential, and certainly as far as the industry concerned, those who embark upon lobbying exercises both in-house and as a consultant, we would concur with that view. That is, as Gregor says, that's the route that you'd want to secure if you want to convince someone of a case you would like to have a meeting. That's the usual objective.
The only MSPs that have chiefs of staff are ones that watch too much West Wing, I would suggest, Mr Duncan. But Willie Sullivan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about volume of contact as well, where you can kind of trace a narrative and story. If you want to be able to be transparent and say, did this level of lobbying have any influence in the number of phone calls that are being made, is quite important. You might start off with a face-to-face and finish with a face-to-face, but there might be a lot of communication in between. I think we have to look at why all these other countries include phone calls and written stuff in their submissions, and we don't. On the position of the Parliament that Peter raised, I mean, I think the fact we're having this review was the fact that the Parliament decided we would have a look and see after 2 years how this was working. We'd start at a very, very low level, and there might be needs to incrementally increase it. So I think, having started that at the level, and to make the point about, of course, there's lots of great lobbying and good lobbying, and it's really important that lobbying takes part. There's also, some bad lobbying. It's not lobbying is not good or bad per se. There's good and bad. We can look at the history of the tobacco industry, pharmaceutical industry, the alcohol industry. There's been the carbon-based industries. There's been industries out of the financial sector. There's been, and these are political calls that MSPs and the public have to make. But where people are trying to influence public policy, and they have to be able to make the decision whether it's in their interests or whether it's in their interest and the public interest, or whether it's not in the public interest, then that information has to be available, and that's why transparency and things like phone calls and emails to look at the volume of communication, I think, is very important.
Neil Bibby?
There's obviously been calls for expanding the communications to emails and other correspondence. I think the CBI mentioned it in its evidence, and other organisations have as well, about freedom of information requests being used to get information about contact, and obviously that applies to the Scottish Government and ministers. But obviously we've seen concerns recently about ministers taking decisions about what meetings are minuted and what are not minuted, FOI requests, basic FOI requests being refused on cost grounds. So I don't really want to open up a debate about freedom of information request on its own, but does the panel accept that there are weaknesses in how the freedom of information is operating, and we can't just rely on that in terms of full transparency around contact with, particularly around government ministers?
And just as an addition to that, I mean, is there a role for more proactive reporting from ministers rather than waiting for freedom of information requests or registers into the lobbying? That in itself seems like greater transparency. Anyone want to kick off on Mr Bibby's question? Get an indication. Gregor, Scotland again.
Thanks, Convener. I think it's an interesting point, and I think there probably are a lot of legitimate questions around the use of freedom of information requests, minuting meetings, etc. But my point would be that's not necessarily a problem for the lobbying register to solve. That's a problem for the freedom of legislation, freedom of information legislation, and that process to solve. And you hope these things can complement each other. So I would be aware of any angle that would suggest we could maybe expand the scope of the Lobbying Act to cover for perhaps other areas of transparency-based legislation that aren't working as we hope they would be. I think that we should continue to focus on the specific problems we do know exist with the Lobbying Act around some of the practical challenges, etc., that this review could help fix.
Anyone else remotely? Willie Sullivan, do you think the FOI Act and the Lobbying Act complement each other?
Well, I think they should, as much as possible, and they do to an extent. But I mean, I think it comes back to Graham Simpson's point. It's about how you can put information and data out there, but how to understand it and how to make sense of it. And maybe if we all thought about how that is a starting point about gathering information, then how to make it. How to make it accessible and understandable, and not this is probably being idealistic, but not putting lots of barriers in the way for the public being able to access it. Going back to the founding principles of the Parliament, which was about openness and accountability.
Mr. Webber, you have any follow-up questions?
I just wanted to ask some questions about the reporting. If I do that now,
please, on you go.
There's been currently the Act doesn't require any information on the amount organisations spend on lobbying activity, although other jurisdictions do. Can I ask Willie Sullivan how because I think you've called for that in your evidence, how that would increase transparency, and ask the rest of the panel if there's a need for that kind of information, and also to ask whether there should be a threshold in terms of the amount that's spent in terms of reporting in terms of lobbying costs.
There's a direct question there for Willie Sullivan, so I'll take Willie Sullivan first, and then I'll go to Peter Duncan.
Well, I think if we're trying to give the public information about what interests are influencing public policy, how they're influencing them, and so that they can make a judgment about whether it's in the public interest or not, then I think how much money that a campaign spending on that is a crucial piece of information. If I'm spending a couple of £100 on a campaign to improve the Lobbying Act, it'd be different from spending hundreds of thousands on it, through public information campaigns or through or through lobbying activity. So I think that is a crucial piece of information, and we all know that how much organisations budget for particular campaigns is probably pretty accessible to the organisation. How much a client would spend on a public affairs company to do the influencing for them is easily findable. So this argument that it's difficult to find the sum and express it, I don't think holds up. And we could, on your point about whether there should be a lower limit for sure. You know, if people are spending, you know, under a few £1,000 on the lobbying activity, that's not that of great interest. But if people are spending, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds on trying to influence public policy, I think that should be publicly available.
Peter Duncan, then Gregor Scotland.
I think, Convener, that this is an area where ASPA represents both public affairs professionals working in-house, if you like, and also membership organisations, and also as consultants. And there really is a unanimity of view across those groups that it'd be really impractical and administratively difficult, if not impossible, to deliver what Mr Sullivan's looking for. I mean, the nature of communications campaigns, and I stress that lobbying is only one element of the way of the integrated communications campaigns that organisations, whether they're charities or commercial organisations, undertake, means that actually splitting out the cost of lobbying is a really administratively difficult thing to do. It's the same people who are undertaking both exercises. Furthermore, if a value is attributed to undertaking a campaign which resulted in 2 face-to-face meetings with different MSPs, and a value was communicated to the lobbying registrar, how is the lobbying registrar going to verify that information? If it's very difficult and is going to require judgment calls, decisions taken by the person reporting it, how is the registrar going to verify that that information is accurate? The administrative burden in complex organisations in splitting down the amounts of management time that were attributed to individual campaigns is something that we think would be disproportionate. But importantly, we don't see any evidence that it's actually going to deliver increased effectiveness in determining what gets to the heart of lobbying. I mean, ultimately, free lobbying is often, as I'm sure members of the committee know, is often the most effective. It's often, it's the individual handwritten letter by a wee old lady writing to every MSP across Scotland. That cuts through and gets to the heart of the issue and makes an impression. And therefore, I don't think necessarily because £1,000 rather than £100 was spent on a lobbying exercise necessarily means that it was 10 times more effective. Very often, quite the reverse.
Gregor Scotland.
Thank you. 2 points I would make in response to the question about costs involved. First one, on a practical level, I would take a different view to Willie Sullivan on that, in the sense that I do think working out exact amounts of money or even rough amounts of money spent preparing and carrying out any example of regulated lobbying would be extremely difficult and time-consuming. From writing a briefing to booking a room to transport, I just don't know where you start that process and where you stop that process. And I agree with the point that it's very difficult to come up with a figure that could in any way be verified by registrar's team. Second point would be, again, I would come back to the question I raised earlier about, is there evidence here of a problem that needs solved? And I think all the evidence would suggest that the Parliament has a very good record ensuring there's equal opportunity for everybody to access MSPs and the parliamentary process in general. I don't think there's any evidence that access is dependent on spend. If you look at a couple of stats from the Registrar's annual report, I think show that sense of who has engaged at Holyrood over the last couple of years. It's the disability, health and social care sector that's top of the list of registrants by volume, with 14% of all registered accounts. And that sector also has the most information returns of any sector, with 20%. In both of those categories, that's followed by equality and social issues in second place. And if you look at the number of information returns by type of organisation, far and away the most returns are made by charities. So I think there's around 41% of the total number of returns come from charities. So I don't think there's any evidence of a problem between money and access at Holyrood addressed. I think there are lots of other areas of the Act that do need addressed that we could focus on trying to improve, but I don't think that it's...
We've only got 10 minutes left, so if I can encourage brevity, please, in comments and questions, because there is a couple of areas I think we do want to cover. So back to you, Neil Wibby.
Yeah, just lastly, can I ask about timescales on reporting? The Law Society and others have pointed to a potential weakness in that timescales don't allow for the greatest public scrutiny, and if we want to improve transparency, we should potentially look at those timescales in the sense that the public may not know for 6 months contact and lobbying that's been going on and in those 6 months legislation may have been and gone, decisions may well have been made a matter of months ago. So would you support a shortening of the 6 month reporting period to maybe something like a quarterly period, which I think is what they have in Ireland?
So can I ask anyone that wants to come back on this to say yes or no, and what they think that time period should be? I've seen an indication from Willie Sullivan, then I'll go to Peter Duncan.
Yes, I think, you know, as I said, the initial introduction was to go in gently and to allow people used to it. So 6 months was probably okay for that, but now I think we should go to quarterly.
Okay. Peter Duncan?
No, we don't necessarily think that shortening that time period would be a meaningful improvement. There's a balance to be struck. Bear in mind, for some conversations that are particularly sensitive, whether they're commercial sensitivities and so on, and I think that 6 month period does allow for flexibility in dealing with that. Also, it does allow registrants to comply with the legislation in the way that is most administratively straightforward for them, to minimise that administrative burden. So whether they choose to do it on a quarterly or sometimes 6 monthly basis, that allows them to minimise that burden. And frankly, if there isn't any evidence of go back to this key point, there's no evidence of the regulation so far unearthing a problem, but there's high compliance with, as the registrar's report this week makes clear, there's high compliance with the rules. Why make it more difficult and more complex and more likely that people will by default miss deadlines? I don't think that adds anything to the regulations in the future.
Thank you. And again, just conscious of time, Craig Wilson.
Just on Mr Bibby's point, I think that was certainly something we mentioned in our evidence, that that there is that hypothetical scenario where if people were using the 6 month period routinely, then it's feasible that they have influenced a member of parliament, and if legislation has passed and that influence is not known about until long after the legislation is passed. So it's a valid point. I think from the evidence that we have, the amount of time being spent by organisations is relatively low. And I don't foresee any issue with organisations having to report on those deadlines quarterly. Certainly, I think it would be manageable. But just on Peter Duncan's point about, unnecessarily introducing something that people might then fall foul of, I think the presumption of innocence and good faith should continue, which the registrar team have been excellent with. If people make a mistake or don't submit something, it's assumed it was an error. So as long as that is maintained, then I don't really see it being a huge issue.
Thank you. Graham Timpson.
Thanks, Convener. I'm aware of the time. Can I just go back to something that Peter Duncan said right at the start of the session? Peter, you said there's been no great scandal unearthed by this. Can I suggest that no great scandal is ever going to be unearthed by the lobbying register? Because if there was anything dodgy about any meeting with an MSP or government minister, it's unlikely to ever appear on the register. Nobody would register it. So no scandal is ever going to come up on this register. So on that point, and I suppose that ties in with what Alex Neil was saying earlier about undue influence. So on that point, can we discuss compliance? And can we discuss penalties? So are the checks and balances around compliance strong enough, and are the penalties strong enough if you don't comply? And Peter, since I've put you on the spot, you might want to come back to me on the point I've made.
I So yes, Mr. Simpson, I take the point. I mean, if you're talking about major scandal, then probably you're talking about avoidance of the regulations rather than someone who's recording information. But I think what the first 2 years has shown us is probably that this 2 years has shown us that there hasn't been any great surprise. I mean, a lot of the information that's being recorded is probably what we expected. The vast majority of the conversations that are being had by the sectors that we expected, very often charitable sectors, environmental sectors, and so on. And all I see is evidence of a healthy dialogue between the outside world and parliamentarians, which creates a better informed Parliament. I mean, as far as your point about whether there are whether any improvements we can make. I mean, I think our statement makes very clear that we've engaged healthily with the process, but we fundamentally think that the balance has been got just about right as far as the legislation is just now.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to come in on that? Willie Sullivan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the issue is about big scandals. It's about having information by which people to make judgments, and different people will have different views about what is undue influence or not. And I think it's right that if we have more information and that shows that there's a healthy dialogue between, different parts of society and the government, that's a good thing. And, and that's part of the process of instilling confidence. It's in the dark and in the opaqueness that kind of rumour and myth and kind of distrust form. So I think that's the point of it, not to expose scandal, but to give confidence.
Of sanction? Any
sorry, yeah. I mean, I think the sanctions are fine. I mean, I would advocate, more making people more compliant with it where necessary. But I know that's a resource issue, and if it was possible, I would certainly support that. We would certainly support that.
And I'll take brief comments from Gregor Scotland and then back to Peter Duncan again, who wishes to come in on sanctions.
Thanks, Convener. I think on the issue of compliance and sanctions, I think the fact that we have in full compliance with the register shows that the sanctions are sufficient. And I think rather than any sort of threat of a financial penalty, it's actually the reputational damage to most organisations from non-compliance. I also think it validates the common sense approach that the registrar and his team have taken in terms of if something's not quite right, there's an assumption that something may have been done by mistake rather than deliberately, and through some sort of exchanges of information it can be cleared up pretty quickly. So I think the registrar's approach on that has been very helpful.
And Peter Duncan?
Yeah, sorry, I realised I didn't reply to Mr. Simpson's point on sanctions. I mean, just to agree with Greg, I mean, I think the sanctions that are in place are reasonable. I think what the evidence of the first 2 years has shown us is that there is complete willingness on behalf of people who are having conversations, regulated conversations, to comply with the Act. And actually the very positive and helpful way in which the registrar's team have engaged with the sector has been very helpful in creating that culture of compliance. I don't think sanctions are seen as particularly relevant. People want to comply with this, and I think the sanctions were appropriate at the time, remain appropriate, but I can't see them being deployed.
Thank you. We're literally in our last couple of minutes, but I do want to give the opportunities to this panel to give any brief comments that they might have on our theme 3, which is the non-legislative changes. We've obviously had one suggestion already around the change of the interface, but if anyone has any suggestions on the non-legislative changes that could be brought in, please indicate and share them with us now. Gregor Scotland.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, we've covered this sort of in spells already, but I do think there are some areas where it would be helpful to provide some change. So I touched on it earlier, clarity around the exemption where somebody is invited to give evidence would be very helpful, as would clarity around the constituency exemption that exists. I know that causes a lot of difficulties for some organisations. It has value. I know it was introduced for a reason, but the definition and the guidance that exists of a place where the person's business is ordinarily carried on is not always clear to interpret. How does that apply if you operate predominantly online, or if you're an energy company that operates in just about every postcode, or a supermarket that has a store in every constituency and certainly every region? And so I do think some clarity around those exemptions would be very helpful for organisations trying to comply. Just one final point, and it's a small point, but I think the 6-month nil return could be, in short, removed. If you haven't carried out any regulated lobbying, I don't see what need there is for you to submit an information return to the register. That just seems an unnecessary burden with no obvious benefit. But in the interest of time, I will pause there.
Anyone else want to come in on non-legislative change suggestions? Willie Sullivan?
Support those, and to say that the ordering of the information around campaigns within the would be a good change to the way the data is handled.
Okay, and I see Peter Duncan wanted to come in.
Just so you didn't think we didn't have any view on changes that can be made. I mean, to reinforce the user point, I think the events point would be if we can get a better way of reporting and reducing the burden of events. I think that would restore a lot of confidence amongst people who are concerned about inadvertently transgressing the regulations.
Thank you. And Craig Wilson, any final comments or suggestions on that?
Generally in agreement with that. I think it is much more about reducing the burden of the user experience. It's hard to know exactly which would require legislative change and what wouldn't, but certainly just one of the things that wasn't mentioned is this misunderstanding of what lobbying perhaps is. So certainly we submit returns that we believe to be lobbying, and they're rejected because there was no concrete or specific ask. So perhaps if that could be clarified as well, or perhaps just taken at face value, as long as everything else was correctly filled out, then that would just reduce that administrative burden on organisations.
Excellent. Can I thank Peter Duncan, Gregor Scotland, Willie Sullivan and Craig Wilson for their evidence this morning, and I'm now going to suspend briefly as we change witnesses. Thank you all so much. Can I welcome our second panel of witnesses this morning, also giving evidence as part of the committee's post-legislative scrutiny of Lobbying Scotland Act 2016. Can I welcome James Adams, Director, Royal National Institute for Blind People, Scotland, who is joining us remotely. Fergus Bowden, Parliamentary Officer, Friends of the Earth Scotland, who is participating on behalf of Scottish Environment Link and joins us in person today. Alison Douglas, Chief Executive, Alcohol Focus Scotland, who is joining us remotely. Brian Simpson, Regulation Policy Executive for the Law Society of Scotland, who is also joining us remotely. And Susan Webster, Head of Policy and Campaigns, MND Scotland, who is also joining us remotely. Fergus Bowden, if you wish to speak, just indicate to me by raising a hand, please. You do not need to touch your microphone, as that will be activated automatically. And to our witnesses joining remotely, please again raise your hand, as I can see you on the screen in front of me, or type R into your chat function, and I will take you at the earliest opportunity. If we do lose connection with you, I will come back to you at a later point. I understand that all our witnesses have been following the first session and therefore will know the issues and comments that have been raised so far. And again, members will be asking questions, but I do encourage witnesses to respond to each other's points too. Witnesses will have noted that the committee paper suggests that this panel focuses on themes 2 and 3 for this session. However, before I do so, I'd like to ask witnesses whether they have any brief comments that they would like to make on theme 1, which is the impact of the Act to date. So I'll start, seeing as you're in front of me, with Fergus Bowden, and then I'll go to Susan Webster, and then follow it around that way. So Fergus Bowden.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. In terms of the impact on the operation of the Act to date, I think the only comments I'd maybe reflect on from the first panel and from our experience is that we have concerns that the impact has been limited in achieving both the goals of the original Act, but also the broader principles, the founding principles of the Scottish Parliament of openness and transparency. I think there's two issues that I think that concerns are broken down into. I think there's a balance to be struck between creating transparency in the lobbying, but also in not creating too much unnecessary additional work for those conducting the lobbying. I think that Act is a really welcome initial step into creating transparency, but there is a risk that what we've created almost captures the worst of both worlds, in that we have quite a system that perhaps isn't necessarily easy to use, it's difficult to register your lobbying, but equally only has limited impact in improving transparency, and really only gives a limited insight into the lobbying in Scotland. So I think in terms of the impact on the operation, we welcome what the Act set out to do. We welcome the initial steps it's made, but we think that from our experience there's perhaps more that could be done to make it easier to use and to capture a bit more of the lobbying that's happening in Scotland.
Thank you, Fergus Bowden. I'll go to Susan Webster.
Thank you. In terms of impact, one of the sort of areas that when we think about impact, we are sort of thinking about, we would really like to know to what extent are the public looking up the register and finding and going to find information, particularly at small charities like ourselves. Are people going in and trying to find out what kind of lobbying that we are doing? And I don't know if full impact can really be assessed without knowing the answer to that. In terms of the impact on our charity, it's not too onerous. It can be frustrating and protracted at times, sort of going backwards and forwards in terms of some submissions being returned and suggestions for reworking. That can be a prolonged and frustrating process at times. In terms of impact on people with motor neuron disease, the impact on them is, of course, our fundamental concern in everything that we do and everything that we spend time doing. Does it have an impact on them? Absolutely not. However, it would if the sort of increases in terms of communications to be potentially extended within the legislation to include written or face-to-face, and that would have potentially a negative impact on them, because we are a small staff team and the more, a very, very small staff team, there's only one full-time member of staff and one part-time member of staff that does our public affairs activities. So any increased burden would have a negative impact on people with the illness, because we would have less time to do the work with them that is of actual benefit to them.
Thank you, Sue Webster. I'm going to go to James Adams and then Brian Simpson.
Thank you, Convener. On the impact, RNB is an organisation which is, tries to ensure compliance with sort of regulations and legislation. And for this, we have complied fully. We've made 75 submissions over the period from its inception. A couple of things I would sort of note is that as a charity, and we're a sort of fairly large charity, and actually most of our staff are actually work in service delivery. So, the field of public affairs and engaging with politicians in a lobbying sort of context isn't something they would do in their sort of day-to-day work, very rarely. But nonetheless, we took it very seriously. We provided training for our staff and made sure they're aware that if they're in a context where they might be engaging with an MSP, that they would let the public affairs team know, so that we can sort of read out what would be construed as lobbying and so forth, so that we can actually make sure that we report it properly. Now, one of the issues with that, an unintended consequence, was that, I can put it around an example, we had an event to celebrate our 150th anniversary not long after the inception of the Lobbying Act. And to support that, because we had a few hundred people coming to it, as well as quite a lot of MSPs, we had to give a sort of briefing to staff who were coming to support the event. And after the event, what we found was that some of the feedback was that some of the staff were worried about engaging with MSPs in case they said something wrong. They might contravene the sort of Lobbying Act. So that was a bit of learning for us to try and, in a way, of sort of dealing with staff. But I just think there's, be slightly careful there isn't a sort of, it doesn't have a sort of counter effect of actually putting some people off from wanting to engage with politicians if they're not used to operating in the public affairs sort of field. So that was just an observation that we'd sort of had. It's just about trying to get and there's also this sort of the bureaucracy of it. Whilst we understand the need to report regular basis, it does take up one of my staff's time, about sort of 4 or 5 hours sort of month, and actually making sure we've got all this sort of done. Whilst it's very important, a sort of streamlined reporting process, it would be something we probably want to ask about, but I think I might come up later on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adams. I'll go to Brian Simpson and then to Alison Douglas.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to say, as a professional body, Redchester, as an active lobbyist, the Law Society supports the need and principle of transparency through statutory regulation of lobbying activity. The Act itself introduced a level of regulation which previously did not exist, and therefore it's certainly gone some way to promote transparency over the past 2 years. However, there are perhaps some improvements that could be considered which may help to further strengthen transparency and therefore public confidence and that of the lobbying sector itself. In relation to the question around the impact to ourselves, there's certainly been an impact which there was always going to be, because this was a new requirement. We've developed quite robust internal processes to ensure that we capture all of our lobbying engagement and that these are registered in a timely manner. We had to introduce training to all of our staff. We had to put the related policies and processes in place, which took some IT development. The time that staff actually now commit, now that all of our policies and processes are actually in place, the time that our team actually commit to ensuring that we capture all of our lobbying activity is some time, but it's not a significant amount of time. I would consider it to actually be negligible, because we're talking maybe a few hours per week of a colleague's time, if indeed that.
Thank you. The first panel of witnesses discussed whether changes were required to the legislation, and if so, what changes might be. So I'd like to continue with that conversation that we're having around theme 2. Oh, sorry, Alison Douglas, I've completely missed you out there. I apologise. I'm going to go to Alison Douglas, then I'll go back to where I was before. So my apologies, Alison Douglas.
Thanks, convener. And in the interest of transparency, I just wanted to make clear that Alcohol Focus Scotland is a member of SALT. But I think the two questions there for me are really around has the Act increased transparency, and how easy is it both for lobbyists and the public to use? And those issues came up in your first session. And a couple of members of the committee were asking the question about whether the Act had actually prevented people from having undue influence. I think that's very difficult to know, but I think undoubtedly the fact that this is bringing into public scrutiny the activities of lobbyists surely will have had some deterrent effect in people undertaking activities which are not really acceptable. So I think that the lack of examples of people misusing lobbying doesn't necessarily mean that the Act itself isn't having a positive effect. I think the question that came up again and again in the first session was about the scope of the Act and the scope of the activities that are covered. And we would certainly wish to see the Act extended to cover a wider range of activities and a wider range of individuals or groups of people. I think in terms of the accessibility, both for those who are registering their activity and for the public and others in using the register, again, the issue of the usability of the interface has come up again and again. And we would like to see improvements to that to enable the submission of information to be simplified, but also some lessons to be learned from the example of Ireland about how searches can be undertaken on the lobbying register. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm now going to hand over to Willie Coffey to kick off theme 2, the status quo or legislative reform.
Thanks very much, convener, and good morning to this panel as well. Alison, you kind of started to take us into the area that we want to discuss now. What we want to ask the panel and get all your views on the record is your thoughts on whether we should just maintain the status quo or reform the Act in respect of two key issues for us. The first one, the communication methods that are to be regulated as lobbying, are they the right ones? And at the moment it's face-to-face lobbying. So we'd like to ask you your views on whether that should be extended to include other forms of communication. The second area is the people that are covered by the Act, that being MSPs, members of the Scottish Government, law officers, junior ministers, special advisors and the permanent secretary. Should we extend it to cover other people under the terms of the Act? And I'd be really obliged if we could hear your views clearly for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Can I ask who wishes to kick off from our witnesses? Either raise your hand or pop an R in the chat function. And if no one does, I'll pick on someone. Fergus Bowden.
Yeah, we would support an extension of the Act in both these areas. I think we particularly got concerns around the lack of coverage of non-face-to-face communication, particularly in regard to phone calls. And I think, as the first panel touched on, we're in the last year we've entered, well, the past 6 months we've entered a new age of communication that now we can communicate with people via Zoom across the country. The Act as it stands means that a video conversation with someone is registerable, but a non-video call where it's just audio only isn't registerable. And I like to think there's 4 people calling in today by video. I like to think if one of them webcams died, they'd be no less persuasive than they are when we can see them. And to us, the exemption for having to be face-to-face is no longer fit for purpose, and we question its inclusion in the first place. We also would be supportive of extending the Act to cover senior civil servants. I think some of our most productive conversations, particularly particularly detailed conversations around the creation of legislation or the implementation of regulations happen with civil servants, and often a civil servant will be quite a specialist in an area, and if you can meet them and discuss perhaps some of your more detailed asks, it's a really effective way to change the final shape of legislation or decisions. So, I appreciate that maybe extending this to every layer of civil service isn't necessary. There are some people in the civil service who don't have decision-making powers, but certainly those higher-up civil servants who do have decision-making powers, we think should be covered by the Act in some form. The only, I suppose, the caveat I'd add is that we think this should be done in conjunction with, and we might get onto this later, but changing the registration process and making it easier. There's been some legitimate concerns raised about the difficulty in registering what we do. I think if that was made easier, certainly that would make extending the Act more palatable.
Thank you, Fergus Bourne. We'll go to Alison Douglas.
Thank you. We would also support the extension of the Act to cover a wider range of all communications, similar to the points that Fergus has made there. We think that those can be quite significant in terms of influencing decision makers, and that the COVID situation has just accentuated reliance on non-face-to-face contact, and that we need to acknowledge that and respond to it. I think that will give us a much fuller picture of the scale and extent of lobbying activity. Lobbying activity is often a sophisticated mix of interactions with decision makers, partly face-to-face, but I think, again, as came up in the earlier session, that may be being followed up with phone calls and emails, and that is an important part of the overall picture of the lobbying that's taking place. In terms of the scope and the people who should be covered, as an ex-civil servant, I know that the Scottish civil service is quite a flatter structure than UK civil service, and that officials at lower levels in the hierarchy, if I can put it that way, still have significant impact. They still are in receipt of quite a lot of lobbying from organisations, and they do have a significant role in providing policy advice to ministers. So we think that that should be extended to the senior civil service. Thanks.
Thank you. Brian Simpson.
To face-to-face meetings, we expressed the view in the parliamentary passage of the bill back in 2016. We expressed the view at that time that we believe that it should be extended to include all communications. The Lobbying Scotland Act it's quite unique in its approach to face-to-face communications. Only almost all jurisdictions who have any kind of lobbying regulation legislation try to encapsulate written communications and all types of oral communication, not just face-to-face. I mean, what the Act effectively allows for is for a lobbyist, for example, to pick the telephone up and express views, opinions, suggestions, etc., basically lobby an MSP over the telephone. That does not have to be registered or recorded in any way whatsoever. However, if that lobbyist then meets with that same MSP, expresses the same views and comments, etc., that does have to be registered. So there is a little bit of a loophole. It may be also, although we don't have any evidence of this, it may be also the case that some lobbyists perhaps have identified this as a legitimate loophole and one which they can utilise for their own purposes. And they, rather than actually meeting with the MSPs, they are actively just picking the phone up. And also, as one of the other witnesses actually pointed out, the pandemic which we saw ourselves go into and the various lockdowns since 2016 have put more of an emphasis on telephone lobbying activity. We ourselves as an organisation, as I'm sure members of the committee will know, we engage quite heavily with the members of the Scottish Parliament. And our lobbying activity and our engagement has certainly shifted towards other communication methods other than face-to-face. and our video, we are still carrying out some face-to-face via video conferencing, but I do believe that the majority of our activity is actually over the telephone and via email at the moment. In relation to those that it should actually cover, again, as we pointed out, both in our evidence when the bill was going through its parliamentary passage and in our written evidence to this committee, it is actually possible to influence policy development and legislative reforms at a much lower level through senior civil servants. Senior civil servants do have a role of influence over Scottish ministers and potentially MSPs, and the Act actually fails to recognise that. So that's where we stand on that particular point.
Thank you. James Adams.
No, whilst of course, further transparency, has to be a sort of aim objective, in sort of civil Scotland. I just wanted to, look at the sort of bureaucracy on that. So, RNB Scotland, we represent the interests of blind and parasitic people. That means that in terms of, say, Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament programme, we probably cover about 13, 14 different substantive policy areas with a very small team. And that means that we're engaging with people, MSPs and senior civil servants from a whole panoply and range of government policy areas on a regular basis. So, if we had to report further communication sort of measures or further communication sort of methods that we employ to do that, whilst it might go towards achieving transparency, it's going to put quite a bureaucratic administrative burden on essentially a charity, which, whilst we're a large charity, most of our staff are doing service work. They aren't doing public affairs work. So what it actually means is put a lot of pressure onto a very small team of public affairs workers. So that would, if we were to extend it, much further, we'd have to look at how we would afford that. We'd have to find a way of costing it, because certainly we wouldn't want to reduce our activity in order to find the staff resource to cover the administration of it. But we'd have to find a way of doing it. And another thing I would sort of reflect on is a lot of the things which are pertinent to blind and parasitic people in Scotland are actually done by local authorities. So we're actually regularly bending the ear of councillors and senior council officials, engaging an awful lot of time with them. And, so, I mean, you'd assume if this is the direction of travel, at some point it would get looked at in terms of applying this to local authorities, because there's a lot of areas of lobbying going there. And then if you go down that route, you have to set up a whole cottage industry of monitoring officers and organisations to cope with all the bureaucracy of it. So I just flag that up, not as a reason not to increase it, but just it would be an impact upon certainly our organisation. I would imagine an awful lot of other ones about how we actually service it and to what end, to what extent the public really go and scrutinise it and look at it and what do they find from that. One sort of suggestion that we'd have, I mean, this may not be popular with the MSPs on the panel, but we might want to look at a way of publishing the MSP work diaries and senior civil servant work diaries, because if those are put in the public domain and it says such and such MSP, in their meetings with RNIB, talk about transport issues relating to a transport bill, then rather than all the organisations having to do all the administration of the reporting, it could be done sort of centrally by the pool of MSPs, perhaps a little bit more resource, and that would then actually make it a more sort of smoother system. I appreciate putting MSPs diaries in public domain might cause other issues, but it's just a suggestion.
Does Susan Webster wish to add anything to any of the comments? And then I've got a number of supplementary requests.
Yes, thank you. In terms of extending the communications, I mean, there's no doubt that our greatest concern would be the extension to written communications. As was highlighted in the earlier session, with emails, for example, you don't know what's been read, and has it been by a member of staff rather than the actual MSP themselves? And perhaps it's actually because that is essentially emails are really almost, I feel, an intent to lobby rather than lobbying itself. You know, it's the intention is there, but is actual lobbying taking place in many emails? Probably not. Extending it to civil servants is an interesting one. I mean, most of the work that we carry out with civil servants is really it's working groups that are essentially initiated by the Scottish Government. So while, you know, we're very much asked for our views, and it's very much led by them, we're asked for our views, we're asked to give our opinions on certain things and make requests within that sort of scope. So I'd be interested to know what these kind of how these working groups would figure in that process. One thing in terms of, you know, how how amending the Act could be helpful would be extending the exemptions that are currently listed. For example, the small organisation, it's actually just been made ahead of me that you know, similar to the RNIB, as I said earlier, we only have, you know, 2 members of staff who engage in public affairs activities, and perhaps if that could be brought into how the small organisation exemption, if that could be, rather than the staff numbers in total, how many public affairs staff do you have? If that the small organisation exemption could be reworked to take that into consideration, that could potentially make a big difference. Another smaller issue, but relevant nonetheless, I feel, is that cross-party groups are exempt, but only if they're quoted. And to me, that doesn't really make sense, because I don't think your lobbying is any, you know, so your lobbying isn't considered regulated if you're in a cross-party group meeting with several MSPs, but it is considered regulated lobbying if you've only got one MSP in the meetings and core it. To me, that doesn't really make sense. So I feel that all cross-party group meetings should be exempt, no matter whether or not they're core it.
Thank you. I've got 2 supplementary requests. I'm going to take Graham Simpson and then Colin Beattie.
Thanks, Convener. I didn't actually know about that cross-party group rule. That does seem very, very strange. I just want to follow up on this, the sort of type of communications that should be included. It struck me when I've been listening to both sessions that, well, firstly on emails, I accept that a lot of emails don't get read. So, yeah, there's no way that you'll know whether they have been. But we've got, all MSPs are subject to an almost weekly, almost daily barrage of emails which are generated by people like Friends of the Earth, you know, and your supporters, and so we get this. It is a barrage of emails from members of the public, but they're generated by organisations. Now, it strikes me that could be regarded as a form of lobbying. So I just wondered what people think about that.
Before I take an answer, I'm going to go to Colin Beattie, because it may be a similar-ish question. If not, then people can answer them as a collective. But I'll go to Colin Beattie.
Yeah, it's a wee bit different. I was going back to what James Adams was saying in connection with the resources needed if the variety, or at least if lobbying was extended to say emails and so forth. I have no feel for the proportion of lobbying as a whole that's actually captured under the present Act. Is it 10%? Is it 20%? We talk about needing an extra body or 2 bodies or so many more hours or whatever, but does anybody actually know what it would take if all the different forms of lobbying were included? I just have no feel.
Okay, so 2 very different questions. So I apologise for that, but people can answer them as a collective if they can, please. Can I get an indication of who wishes to take that? James Adams?
Yeah, just on the 2 points there. The point about the sort of, as it was put, barrage of emails that MSPs might receive. I think that's likely a fair point. And imagine some time this particular campaign, suddenly there's like thousands of emails going into an inbox, and it might get you looking at getting a policy officer to look at the issue, but it's not substantively going to change your view heavily. As a device, it's not something RNB looks at. We prefer much more measured, targeted sort of lobbying and communications when these things come up. In terms of the point about the percentage of the lobbying and the resources, I think that's a very good point. What would it mean? What would that mean? Because I was trying to think. We've done 75 reports since the Lobbying Act came in, which under the current reporting requirements, I racking my brain. I was thinking, if there's a parliamentary bill, how many times might I phone to the ear of an MSP who's potentially doing an amendment, or somebody would try to shift, or a civil servant? Would I be required to write all that down in a log, get it processed, get it all into somebody in my public affairs team, who would then have to have a dialogue with the clerks, who would then probably do ping pong back and forth? You just think that's a lot of bureaucracy. Now, it's necessary for transparency, for the aims of what Civic Scotland's trying to achieve, then by all means, but there needs to be a consideration what that actually means in terms of resources, both at the Parliament, with the MSPs, and with the reporting organisations, because there's no question, if you extend what needs to be covered, then there has to be an extension of the reporting, which is going to cost and take up the time of the people having to do it at both ends. But just something that perhaps the committee needs to sort of think about before extending it.
Thank you, James Adams. I see an indication from Fergus Bowden.
As one of the organisations who do a lot of barraging of MSPs' inboxes, I figured I should probably respond to that. I think that both these questions actually are linked in a way that they both, to me, speak to the need to look at the Act as a whole, and the many different elements of it, and the sort of framework that they create. A member of the public entering an online e-action wouldn't be covered in the Act, even if you extended emails, because of the many exemptions that rightly differentiate between a member of the public and a lobbyist of an organisation. For example, they're not being paid to do that. They are contacting their constituency MSP. They don't have an affiliation to the organisation necessarily. So I think that is maybe a separate issue in a way, because exemptions do omit that. And also, sorry, I should say, I think that's a really important part of our democracy, is that organisations like ours make it easier for people who care about an issue to contact their MSPs. I think engaging in Parliament can be quite a confusing process if you don't live and breathe its many quirks. And actually, one of the things our organisations do is simplify that process for members of the public. On Colin Beattie's point about extending it, and I think you made an interesting point about we don't know how much lobbying is captured, and I think that's a very good point, that we don't know how much lobbying the register captures. I think one of the benefits of extending the Act is that it closes this loophole, which is tied to the definition problem, that the Act only captures lobbying if I make a specific ask of an MSP. I think it says it has to be about parliamentary process or legislation. So if I meet an MSP and just talk to them about the need for, if we both just kind of complain about the lack of bike lanes in their area, according to the Act, that wouldn't be lobbying. If I then said, however, I think you should add an amendment to this bill to increase the number of bike lanes in your area, that would be lobbying. By exempting phone calls, what you do is you create a framework where I could meet someone and establish a relationship with them, explain the underlying points of the issue, and follow that up with a phone call or an email that says, by the way, didn't mention this the other day, but can you put in a amendment to this bill? And because I've done it by phone or email, it isn't covered. And I think for me that is a really glaring omission in this. And one of the risks is that the Act almost creates a framework to avoid having to register things.
Anybody else in terms of our panel wish to respond to Mr. Simpson or Mr. Beattie's? Susan Webster, then I've got a supplementary from Neil Bibby. Oh, sorry, I'll take Susan Webster first, then I'll come to you. Sorry, Susan Webster.
Thank you very much. And just a small point in terms of the badge of emails. What we encourage our supporters to do when they're, say, responding to a request from us is really to talk about, even if they're emailing, they're generally emailing their own MSPs. So there is that personal connection, they are a constituent. But we also encourage them to speak about their own experience and how something affects them. So very much talking about their own experience of the illness and the way different things have impacted on them. So it's very much their personal message. And for that reason, I personally wouldn't see that as lobbying, because it's not really our message. It's all about them. And as was highlighted earlier in the day, our understanding is that's what MSPs want to hear, is about how it affects these individuals in a very personal sense. And in terms of Mr. Beattie's question, I think about how much of the kind of lobbying goes on. I mean, I think there's no getting away from a response that was made earlier in the day that everybody knows that the most effective lobbying is face-to-face. Everybody knows that. And I accept to a degree, telephone conversations as well, but fundamentally sitting down in a room, be that, pre-COVID in a meeting room with an MSP or, a kind of virtual meeting like we're having today. No, everybody knows that that's the way to get your effective lobbying done. So from our point of view, including, emails and things, it's not really going to influence the quality of lobbying that's taking place, because, as I say, everybody knows what's most effective, and that's what they will always strive to do. That will always be the biggest achievement for them, is to have these face-to-face meetings with MSPs, because that's what's most productive.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Neil Bibby. I'm going to go to Neil Bibby and then Brian Simpson and Alison Douglas.
I think obviously the balance that we're trying to strike is between transparency, but also not have anything that's overly bureaucratic. I thought James Adams made a point about, and I hear the point he was making about the number of, like, for example, if we're discussing an amendment in a bill and he speaks to an MSP on a number of occasions, essentially about the same issue, and that being overly bureaucratic. And I hear what Mr. Adams is saying in that regard. Would therefore, is it not important though for there to be transparency about there being at least one phone call with an MSP during that process? So if you weren't recording every single phone call, there should at least be a transparency that during the passage of that bill, there was contact by telephone between your organisation or an organisation and an MSP or MSPs.
I'm going to take Brian, if you can hold back for a moment, Mr. Adams. I'm going to take Brian Simpson, Alison Douglas, and then I'll come to James Adams to respond to that point directly. So, Brian Simpson.
Thank you. That's it. It's a really good point raised in relation to the emails, as in, would that require every email to be registered as a lobbying activity? And how would you know what was the content of that email, and how would you know if that email had been read? I mean, it's not going to be without precedent, because both the UK Parliament and the Republic of Ireland lobbying regulation covers written communications, including emails. So if the committee were that way inclined, they could look at what's happening in those jurisdictions. However, I think it would potentially be problematic. One of the ways potentially around it would be to go back to the very definition of lobbying and perhaps think about that a little bit more. So, for example, does lobbying not necessarily include one-way communication, i.e. sending an email setting out your views, but would it require two-way interaction, two-way conversation? Because that's what you actually get when you do your face-to-face meetings, and that's what you will get in relation to your telephone calls. That's perhaps something that the committee could consider. In relation to how much lobbying activity is actually going on at the moment, quite rightly, it's been pointed out, this is unknown. We just don't know how much activity is actually going on there. We don't know how much face-to-face lobbying activity fell off as a result of the introduction of the 2016 Act. Did more lobbyists actually revert to going back to using telephone for communications? We just don't know that. I don't think there's been any research conducted in relation to Scotland. I do know that down in England, where of course they've got covers the UK Parliament down there, the estimate is that there's only at the moment at the maximum 5% of lobbying activity actually captured, although what the activity they actually capture is very much narrower than what we actually capture up here. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Alison Douglas.
Yes, I think, the point is well made that face-to-face contact is probably the most impactful. But I think colleagues have also highlighted that, if you are in a role in an organisation where influencing decision makers is a significant and important part of your work, then what you need to do to be effective is to develop relationships with people that therefore mean that when an email from you comes, it is given, the more attention is paid to it than if it was, if I might put it this way, cold calling. So I think that speaks to the fact that all of those communications have an impact when that relationship has been established. So I think that's why all of those communications need to be within scope and are relevant. I think in terms of the issue about a whole range of individual activities, I think what would be helpful would be to look at the Irish model, where it would appear from the way that you can search on their database that it's possible to look at campaigns and to see the different types of activity that relate to a specific issue that is being raised. So that gives a fuller sense of how organisations are engaging with decision makers. So I think that kind of way, rather than it being simply a register of individual activities and engagement, being able to look at it more from a campaign perspective, I think would be more illuminating for those looking at the information. Thanks.
Thank you. James Adams.
Neil Bibby's sort of question there. I think that's a fair point. Should there be a level of transparency on a phone call or a number of phone calls relating to a particular issue, lobbying issue? It might be the case that if there's like a time-limited engagement, such as a bill going through Parliament, transfer bill, say, it might be that the organisation could put in a sort of a report saying we will be lobbying on these key principal areas that we want to see through this bill over this period, and this will involve the various types of communication. So rather than having to do like a log essentially of every bit of the extended communications that we would do, that we could just sort of be open about the fact we are engaging, and this is what the points we are arguing to try and lobby into this bill, and just have it as a single report rather than having it as 27 that might unfold during the period of that lobbying.
I think that's quite a good suggestion, and then you could list who the MSPs that were covered by that as well. Can I just pick up one general point? The last panel seemed to do this, and this panel seeming to do this, is a general acceptance that face-to-face is more effective and that phone call lobbying isn't. Now, I would counter, going back to Alec Neil and Graham Simpson's question to the last panel, that if you were doing illicit lobbying, or lobbying that was perhaps out with the scope of what was right, that requires a relationship. That requires a level of confidence. It also requires a level of secrecy. And you're more likely to do that by phone than you are in a face-to-face meeting in a Parliament building or in a restaurant or a cafe. So I want to push back slightly on that phone call suggestion and see if anyone has any reflections on that. I see Fergus Bowden.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with what you're saying there. That actually, even if I would disagree that it's any less effective, I think even if it was less effective, it does create a loophole for people to exploit if they wanted to. I'd also add that I think sometimes phone calls are a necessity. I think that, and it doesn't make it any less important. We know that when decisions are made at the last minute, sometimes people have to make a phone call. If you get wind on Monday that there's a statement on Tuesday about an issue you care about, maybe the only way to get in touch with people is over the phone, and we know that has happened. I'd also say that I think we keep saying phone call, but in reality, that, as I said earlier, switching off your webcam is captured as audio only, and I think that we do need to bear that in mind. There have been times that because of internet connection, we've had to call people. So I think I would agree entirely that it's not necessarily less effective, but I also think that we need to bear in mind that sometimes it is the only option. And to me, I don't think that is the public are no less deserving of knowing about those phone calls than they are about a face-to-face meeting.
Can I get an indication from the panel members for those that think calls should be included and those that think calls shouldn't? And so a show of hands, who thinks calls shouldn't be included? And who thinks calls should be included? So that's Brian's, the Law Society, so Brian Simpson, Alison Douglas and Fergus Bowden saying calls should be included, and it looks like Susan and James Adams are abstaining. Is that correct? Is that an abstention from Susan Webster and James Adams? James Adams?
I think there needs to be. I think before we sort of go into saying that would be a firm position, it goes back to the point I was making earlier on. Is that I tried to rack my brain to do some analysis as we were speaking about how many phone calls we might typically make across a whole range of different policy areas, say 14 different areas of government we try and cover. I couldn't even begin to try and think and list that over the last sort of, during the coronavirus period. We've spoken to all sorts of bits of government, for perfectly obvious legitimate reasons. So before we be able to come to a strong position whether it should be included or not, we really want to do some analysis and thinking about, how many calls is that? What does that mean in terms of reporting? How do we report that? Do we report the content of the conversation? What level of detail? It gets potentially quite complicated.
Brian Simpson?
I wanted to say that although the Law Society would support telephone communications being covered, along the lines of what Mr Adams has just actually said there, we would agree that there would need to be some kind of mechanism behind this to ensure that it doesn't have to be every single telephone call that would have to be recorded. Because as pointed out by one of the panel members a little bit earlier, you could get into the situation where you have a face-to-face meeting and then that was followed up by numerous telephone calls. Would it be the case that if telephone communications had to be recorded, would it be every single telephone communication on that particular matter? Or would it just be the initial telephone communication where those points and that lobbying activity initially arose, rather than all the subsequent telephone conversations? Because if it was to be all the subsequent telephone conversations, that could be quite onerous on both lobbyists and on the Lobbying Registrar's Department.
Thank you. Any final comments from any panel members on status quo or legislative reform before I move on to theme 3? Fergus Bowden?
Yeah, I think the two things I'd hope that would maybe be considered, just to go back to James's point, the unpopular view maybe in this room about the imbalance in reporting between lobbyists having to do all the reporting and MSPs perhaps not having a requirement to report on their interactions with lobbyists. And I think we would support calls to publish MSP's calendars to some degree. This is something that some groups within the European Parliament do anyway, and there is software out there that does it. I appreciate that we don't need every detail of every MSP's calendar published. We don't need to know what day you go to the dentist, but I think there are elements of it that should be published. And I think that would go a long way to perhaps reducing the burden on lobbyists while creating a much broader overview of the system.
I'll take Alison. Is it particularly on that point? Alec Neil?
Can I just make a point? The vast bulk of an MSP's contacts are with their constituents, and there is no way I would be publishing a list of constituents I've met or visited or spoken to. It's a total breach of confidence in the relationship with the constituent. And with all due respect to MEPs, they never dealt with constituency work. They might get the odd one, but the vast bulk of our work is that. And where I think, and I see where you're coming from, but it might be better to put a general duty on MSPs to report a situation where they believe they have been lobbied for something, but it hasn't been registered by the person doing the lobbying. I think that would be something, I mean, I think it's got some practical issues to be addressed about it, but I think that would be a reasonable proposition. I think it's a total negation of our constituents' rights if we start publishing MSPs' diaries, and I, for one, would not do it under any circumstances.
Alison Douglas.
The other issue that I wanted to raise in terms of the legislation was an issue again that came up in the first session around disclosure of the financial costs of lobbying. I think something that we kind of haven't explicitly touched on is this the different scale and magnitudes of lobbying activity by different organisations based on the capacity and resources that they have available to them. And I think it would be naive to assume that that doesn't have an impact in terms of influence. So I would be supporting the call from SALT earlier to include disclosure of financial information on campaigns as part of the legislation going forward.
Thank you. James
Thanks.
Adams.
I like Neil's point. I mean, I don't think MD is sort of suggesting that we'd look at wanting to know what constituents and their scale, because clearly there's privacy issues there. But if organisations are clearly set up to be lobbying the Parliament to try and affect legislation or to try and influence how governmental resources are utilised, then that is a different party to a constituent. So I think it's those parties. So if an MSP is being lobbied by RNIB or Shell UK or whoever, then it might just be they would put in, or their office would put in, we were lobbied today by RNIB in the transport bill on these issues. And then if they put it in, it just means that you don't have to have hundreds of organisations all around the Parliament, thousands all around the Parliament having to wrestle with how they go about reporting this, and they might not have the staff to do it, and they might not understand the process and they don't do it and all the rest of it. Whereas if the MSPs and the Parliament set up to actually register the lobbying in an appropriate, effective way alongside the clerks, then it would just make it, I think it'd be more efficient as a method, and it would cost less overall to society.
I would counter back that you'd end up in a situation where MSPs were meeting organisations just so they could log them on the logbook rather than actually want to genuinely engage with them, which would, I think, be a counter issue in itself. Neil Bibby?
I just wanted to ask about the timescales on reporting. We discussed it in the last panel, and I think the Law Society had it in their submission that there's a potential weakness here in that the timescales don't allow proper public scrutiny, that decisions can be made, legislation can be passed many months before it's contact with MSPs and decision makers is declared. So could I just ask the panel quickly, would they support a shorter reporting period? If so, why? And if not, why not?
Again, I'll, in the interest of brevity, if you can say yes, no, and if yes, what time frame it should be. Any quick comments on that? Fergus Bowden?
Yes, I would support it. I think the other thing I'd flag about timescales is at the minute you have this sort of 6-month window period where it's not 6 months from the day you lobby, it's 6 months from the end of the period. And actually, I think there's a way to reduce the period to say 3 months or quarterly, but say that it's from the date of lobbying. So for some people, that might actually give you more time. Because if I lobby 3 weeks before the end of the registration period, I only have 3 weeks to register my lobbying. So actually, it could buy you more time in those circumstances.
Brian Simpson?
In the time frame to perhaps every quarter, as we pointed out in our evidence, that is potentially a loophole for the 6 months, because what you could effectively have is if somebody did at the start of the reporting period carry out a lobbying activity, they may not actually report that activity until 5 months, 3 weeks has gone past, at which time whatever they're actually lobbying on For example, if it was a bill down in Parliament that may have gone through its parliamentary process and may be out of the public mind, and that might have been a lobbying activity that might have been of public importance, something the public might have wanted to know about.
Thank you. Alison Douglas.
Be helpful to have it at least quarterly, but I think Fergus's point's well made that having it from the date of the lobbying activity would be more helpful than having it in blocks as it is currently. Thanks.
Excellent. And from Susan Webster and James Adams, do you broadly agree with that? Just in the interest of brevity. Yep, James Adams broadly agrees with that. Susan Webster? No. Okay, we've lost Susan there.
There is 100% accurate. Sorry?
Sorry, we lost you there for a moment. If you just say that again for us, Susan Webster.
Sorry, we submit all of our returns immediately, just so we can be sure they're 100% accurate. We don't really have any time. It wouldn't create a problem for us if that was shortened.
Thank you. And there's just one last area we want to cover around legislative before we come to non-legislative improvement, which is around exemptions. Anyone have any concerns about whether they think the current exemptions are fit for purpose, whether that needs to change, and if so, and how? We obviously heard a bit about the communications on request in the first panel, but any thoughts or suggestions around the exemptions and any clarifications or clearances that are needed in any further legislative form? Are people quite content? I see an indication from, I'll take Susan Webster first, and then I'll come to Fergus Bowden.
Just to highlight what I said earlier, initially was the exemptions around CPs and the small organisation exemptions. I can go over the points that I made at the time again, or I don't know if you've got note of that, but they were the two issues that we would like attention.
No problem. We've got them. I'll take Fergus Bowden, then I'll take Alison Douglas.
I think the two main exemptions that I'd point to that I think need review are the constituency exemption, or I think, I can't remember how it's phrased in legislation, but an exemption if the business is related to activities within the MSP's region or constituency. I think a previous panellist pointed out this means that if you have if you're an energy company with equipment in every constituency, you technically don't need to register. I think some clarity on that to make sure that actually it means local business exemptions, because as a national coalition, Link often does like national activity that is delivered through local organisations. So local organisations campaigning on a national campaign and could technically be exempt. So it'd be great to get clarity on that. And also the on-request exemption. We know that if someone requests to meet us about one issue, any good lobbyist will try and shoehorn in about five other issues. It'd be good to get clarity on whether those other 5 issues need registered.
Thank you. Alison Douglas.
I would agree on both of those, that if it is genuinely a constituency matter, then it should be exempt, but often it would be possible for national issues to be being raised, and just on a technicality really, that the lobbyist is from that constituency, that would not be subject to the register requirements and would not be subject to scrutiny, and that just seems illogical. And similarly, on the exemption, the other forms of exemption around, sorry, I've lost the train of thought there. Sorry, excuse me, I'll come back.
No problem. Brian Simpson.
To the constituency exemption, I'll just echo what the other panellists have actually said. This does seem to cause quite a bit of confusion. The Law Society actually sat as part of the working group which developed the parliamentary guidance around this. I know at that time, the working group itself had a lot of problems with this exemption. It is one which is very, very much open to interpretation, and clarification would be most welcome around this. So I think this does need to be looked at a little bit closer.
Thank you. And before I move on to theme 3, anyone want to come in with any final points? No. Excellent. I'm now going to hand over to Neil Bibby just to kick off theme 3, which is the non-legislative improvements. We've kind of covered some of the issues already, but perhaps explore them in a bit more detail. So, Neil Bibby.
Yeah, obviously we've covered the legislative changes, potential legislative changes, but in terms of, you know, we've covered some, as the convener said and touched on it in the last panel. There's practical issues that people have in terms of, you know, uploading data and some of the problems they have with reporting. So just see what the panel's got to say about non-legislative changes that you think could be made to improve the system.
So we've heard around the interface, for example, the suggestion of a mobile app, the suggestion of bulk uploads, all I think seem rather sensible. But any other comments on them or any other suggestions the committee would be happy to hear? I see Brian Simpson.
Just in relation to the interface, again, just referring back to the working group, on the parliamentary working group, when we looked at the guidance, this is one of the things that was suggested and was a little bit of a concern at that time, was relation to the ability to be able to upload bulk returns, because at the moment what you're required to do is you've got to submit an individual return for every engagement. Now, if you're at an event and you perhaps meet with, whether it's a social event or whatever kind of event it is, perhaps one down at Parliament, and you meet with perhaps 10 MSPs, that requires you to put in 10 separate information returns. So it would be very, very helpful if you could do some kind of bulk return to list all of those on one return, particularly if you're actually discussing the same subject matter. I think that would be very, very helpful. Also, it's got to be remembered that this was only introduced 2 years ago. There's always going to be technological advances and changes. Technology is evolving. The way everybody uses computers are evolving. The expectations are evolving. So our experience actually of searching on the register and using the register is that it's very, very user-friendly. I mean, if any of the committee members or anybody else wants to go off and actually try searching on the UK Parliament's register, then they'll see how difficult searching information can actually be. As I say, our view is that at the moment it's actually good for purpose. It's easily accessible. You can put in the MSP's name and oppose up all the engagement activities. So I think, yeah, we're happy with where it is at the moment, but agree that there is perhaps some improvements that can be made.
Thank you. I'll take Alison Douglas, then James Adams.
Thank you. Sorry, just to add to my comments on the previous session, then the exemption, the one that I missed was the on request. And it was just to say that I think sometimes there can be a bit of a fuzzy line, which may, again, just reduce transparency. You know, we've had experience where we've had conversations with MSPs about an issue, and we've subsequently been approached for input or parliamentary questions or for debates. And it seems to me it's not obvious why that should be exempt from the lobbying register, whereas if we had proactively provided that, it would be required to be covered. But sorry, just to move on to the non-legislative side of things, I think there's something there around we don't have a full sense of the extent to which this register is capturing activity in our particular area in terms of alcohol policy. We know from academic research that a lot of activity is not particularly visible and is highly coordinated. And we think it could be useful for the committee in order to get a sense of the extent to which the register is effective in casting light on lobbying activity, to perhaps think about commissioning some research. There could be a triangulation with ministerial diaries and with other sources of information in order to analyse and bring to light whether the register is really capturing the activity that's taking place. we think that could be valuable. It could be done on a case study basis.
Thank you. I'll take James Adams and then Susan Webster.
Just to reinforce what Brian said about the bulk reporting. So, for instance, if you could, just have a little drop-down category that said transport bill, and you'd do a report saying you're going to be engaging with these several MSPs on this issue over the period of the transport bill, and that would just make it a lot easier and sort of quicker, and you can go back and amend it if you happen to broaden it out to engage further MSPs or civil servants and just add it in. The other thing to make it a tiny bit quicker would be things like there's a little address box where you have to type in and do the postcode and everything. Given that a very large percentage of the meetings are probably going to take place in the Scottish Parliament, you could have a couple of fixed address type things in just when you're going and typing it in. So those are just sort of a couple of little changes, but certainly to reinforce the bulk reporting point.
Thank you. Susan Webster.
Thank you. Yeah, we would support sort of previous requests for one event returns, particularly for party conferences, and that would make a big difference. And we would also support a point that SEVO made earlier in terms of, we can have, a reasonable portion of return submissions and suggestions for reworked submissions. And I support what SEVO said earlier in terms of actually either just kind of accepting a submission as it is or rejecting it, rather than, I think the proposal for reworking submissions can be quite problematic, and it can lead to our policy officer, having to kind of go back and forwards. It can all be very, very protracted. So, if they go back to, for example, our CEO who maybe did the lobbying, are you happy with this reworked version? And then so they can, there's a lot of backwards and forwards, and it can be very protracted. So I think there's a lot of value in either just accepting a submission or rejecting it, rather than suggestions for reworking. And I think it kind of leads to a lot of the events, I think, are problematic for lobbying, because if you think of, for example, like party conferences, a lot of the meetings that you have, there's a lot of questions between the register team and our staff. Did lobbying actually take place? Because by nature, these conversations with MSPs at conferences can be very fleeting. They're in the passing. We've got a couple of minutes to highlight our key issues, maybe give them a briefing. So in practice, whether or not they're actually lobbying is quite questionable. And I think that can lead to a lot of these returns being either refused or suggestions for reworking being put forward. And I think that that's something that really needs to be looked forward to. These very kind of events are kind of a category of their own. And I think how submissions that result from them need to be considered so they don't become too burdensome, because to be honest, for our charity, they can be.
Thank you. I've got Alison Douglas wanting to come back in, then I'm going to go to Neil Bibby.
Thanks. It was linked to what Susan was saying. We've also had quite a lot of backwards and forwards with the staff about what constitutes lobbying, and my perception of it is that in practice and in the guidance, a sort of narrower definition is being used than we would understand the Act to be covering. So I think I'm right in saying that the guidance says where it's to inform or influence decisions, which has this implication of there being a call to action, whereas a lot of lobbying may be more general in nature. It may be about raising an issue, getting it on the agenda well in advance of there actually being a decision point. And so we think the guidance could be clarified to make clearer that actually that wider scope should be applied. Thanks.
Thank you. Neil Bibby?
I think the question I was going to ask has kind of been covered there. But obviously, the Act does allow voluntary registrations to be made, but we have heard from some respondents that who have made registrations in good faith that they've been rejected because they don't constitute lobbying. So I don't know if the rest of the panel has any further thoughts on that.
I see an indication from Fergus Bowden.
Yeah, I think the issue of voluntary submissions, you know, I think it's welcome that people can submit if they want to. I guess I question why some people feel they need to do it voluntarily when others aren't, and you know, I've got concerns that that creates a bit of an imbalance, that you have some organisations who are trying to almost maximise the transparency for their work, whereas others would actively avoid making a voluntary submission if they could. And I support the things that everyone else on the panel has said about the ways you could improve the user experience process. I think that the issues with the Act perhaps go beyond just the user experience, but I think we do need to fix the user experience to make the other changes to the Act more palatable.
Thank you, Fergus. We're in the last few minutes of our session, so I'll see if there's any final comments from any of our committee members or any questions from our committee members, and then I'll ask individual panellists to give any final reflections and thoughts. Just to say that you still do have an opportunity to give us more thoughts. If there's anything you thought you've missed or would like to cover, you can send that into the committee and we can reflect that in terms of our next stages. But any final comments from any committee members? None from the committee members. Any final comments or reflections from members of the panel on either what we've heard today in terms of either the three themes or anything even that goes beyond the three themes that you think we should be considering as part of our work? I've got an indication from Alison Douglas, and then I'll come to Fergus Bowden.
Thanks, Convener. I think the point was made that lobbying is really important in helping to inform decision making, but I did think it was worth raising that sometimes lobbying is used to misinform decision makers too, and we've had research in the alcohol field which has shown how information can be misrepresented or selectively provided in order to influence decisions that are being made, and you know that's specifically been documented in relation to minimum unit pricing. And I think that really, for me, underscores why it is so important that we do what we can to maximise transparency, and why we need to ensure that the system that we have is more comprehensive than it currently is. Thank you.
Thank you. Fergus Bowden?
I'll just make 2 points. The first one, to reiterate something that was raised earlier about the issue of costs. I think the costs associated with lobbying are one of the biggest emissions from the legislation. I think introducing some sort of banding system with a minimum threshold would introduce a lot of transparency in quite a user-friendly way. I think costs are probably one of the biggest black holes in the transparency of Scottish politics. Like party conferences, you can spend five-figure sums to get access to ministers or MSPs, and I think that that's something that has very little transparency on it. And the second thing that I'd maybe push back on is something that some panellists said, that no one cares, that people, you know, the man on the street doesn't wake up and wonder what's new on the Lobbying Act. That may be true, but I think that just because people don't care doesn't mean they don't want to care. I think the current system is difficult to use. We know that journalists we've spoken to, and someone made the valid point that a lot of people will hear about lobbying transparency through the media. Journalists we speak to find that the Act itself doesn't necessarily shine enough light for them to get a story. You know, it gives a hint that something's happening, but they don't know the cost of it. They don't know exactly how many phone calls being made. So I think that just because people don't currently care about it doesn't mean there's no scope for this to be something that actually could introduce a real degree of transparency and interest in Scottish politics.
Thank you. Brian Simpson, then Susan Webster.
Just in relation to touching on cost, just what the previous panel member was saying, got to be very, very careful. And I'm sure the committee and members of the panel are aware of this, but when you talk about costs and thresholds, they're actually two separate things. If you put a threshold in place, what that does is that develops a criteria. That is part of the criteria. So, for example, if you fall below a certain threshold, then you don't have to register your lobbying activity. If you're above that threshold, then you do. Therefore, a lot of lobbying activity, which may perhaps at the moment be captured, may, if you introduce a threshold, not be captured. So it might actually reduce transparency. The other point I'd like to make is also, if you want to capture costs, you've got to ask, well, what does that actually add? Okay, fair enough, you're providing more information, but it doesn't actually add anything over and above that. It's not going to increase the number of lobbyists that are actually registering their activity. And also, you've got to be very, very careful, because some of this might actually be business sensitive information, which organisations and bodies might not necessarily want their competitors to actually know about. So they're just a couple of considerations I think it's worth taking into account.
Thank you. Susan Webster.
Thank you. It was just if, the committee could be mindful of if increasing the level of communications and the range of communications is being considered, and, that resulting obviously in an increase in workload, particularly for small charities. One thing that I don't believe has been discussed today is that the impact of COVID and that has had on the charity sector. COVID has meant that a lot of funds that would be brought in from community fundraising, various events, basically event-led fundraising, hasn't been able to take place this year. It's gone. So a lot of charities' income has reduced, and of course that has led to redundancies within the sector, and quite significant redundancies. So if we're talking about increasing workload for charities, that needs to be considered, that actually charities are currently facing much, their resources, their internal resources are much more stretched, and their capacity is much more stretched as a result of the impact of COVID. And that could take quite a long time to recover from. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan Webster. If there are no final comments from any members? No. Can I thank then James Adams, Fergus Borden, Alison Douglas, Brian Simpson and Susan Webster for their time and their contributions this morning. With that, I now close this public part of this meeting as we move into private session.